night, within the mist's obscuring embrace, than he did at day. "Kel," Dockson said, "do you have to stand on a ledge like that? Our plans may be a bit crazy, but I'd rather not have them end with you splattered across the cobblestones down there." Kelsier smiled. He still doesn't think of me as a Mistborn, he thought. It will take some getting used to for all of them. Years before, he had become the most infamous crew leader in Luthadel, and he had done it without even being an Allomancer. Mare had been a tin-eye, but he and Dockson, they had just been regular men. One a half-breed with no powers, the other a runaway plantation ska. Together they had brought great houses to their knees, stealing brashly from the most powerful men in the Final Empire. Now Kelsier was more, so much more. Once he had dreamed of allomancy, wishing for a power like Mare's. She had been dead before he'd snapped, coming to his powers. She would never see what he would do with them. Before, the high nobility had feared him. It had taken a trap set by the Lord Ruler himself to capture Kelsier. Now, the Final Empire itself would shake before he was finished with it. He scanned the city once more, breathing in the mists, then hopped down off the ledge and strolled over to join Dockson and Vin. They carried no lights. Ambient starlight, diffused by the mists, was enough to see by in most cases. Kelsier took off his jacket and vest, handing them to Dockson. Then he untucked his shirt, letting the long garment hang loose. The fabric was dark enough that it wouldn't give him away at night. "All right," Kelsier said. "Who should I try?" Dockson frowned. "You're sure you want to do this?" Kelsier smiled. Dockson sighed. "Houses Urbane and Teniert have been hit recently, though not for their atium." "Which house is the strongest right now?" Kelsier asked, squatting down and undoing the ties on his pack, which rested by Dockson's feet. "Who would no one consider hitting?" Dockson paused. "Venture," he finally said. "They've been on top for the last few years. They keep a standing force of several hundred men, and the local house nobility includes a good 24 mistings." Kelsier nodded. "Well, that's where I'll go then. They're certain to have some atium." He pulled open the pack, then whipped out a dark gray cloak. Large and enveloping, the cloak wasn't constructed from a single piece of cloth. Rather, it was made up of hundreds of long ribbon-like strips. They were sewn together at the shoulders and across the chest, but mostly they hung separate from one another, like overlapping streamers. Kelsier threw on the garment, its strips of cloth twisting and curling, almost like the mists themselves. Dockson exhaled softly. "I've never been so close to someone wearing one of those." "What is it?" Vin asked, her quiet voice almost haunting in the night mists. "A mist cloak," Dockson said. "They all wear the things. It's kind of like a sign of membership in their club." "It's colored and constructed to hide you in the mist," Kelsier said. "And it warns city guards and other Mistborn not to bother you." He spun, letting the cloak flare dramatically. "I think it suits me." Dockson rolled his eyes. "All right," Kelsier said, bending down and pulling a cloth belt from his pack. "House Venture. Is there anything I need to know?" "Lord Venture supposedly has a safe in his study," Dockson said. "That's where he'd probably keep his atium stash. You'll find the study on the 3rd floor, 3 rooms in from the upper southern balcony. Be careful. House Venture keeps about 12 haze killers in addition to its regular troops and mistings." Kelsier nodded, tying on the belt. It had no buckle, but it did contain 2 small sheaths. He pulled a pair of glass daggers from the bag, checked them for nicks, and slid them into the sheaths. He kicked off his shoes and stripped off his stockings, leaving himself barefoot on the chill stones. With the shoes also went the last bit of metal on his person, save for his coin pouch and the 3 vials of metals in his belt. He selected the largest one, downed its contents, then handed the empty vial to Doxson. "That it?" Kelsier asked. Doxson nodded. "Good luck." Beside him, the girl Vin was watching Kelsier's preparations with intense curiosity. She was a quiet, small thing, but she hid an intensity that he found impressive. She was paranoid, true, but not timid. "You'll get your chance, kid," he thought. "Just not tonight." "Well," he said, pulling a coin from his pouch and tossing it off the side of the building. "Guess I'll be going. I'll meet you back at Clubs' shop in a bit." Doxson nodded. Kelsier turned and walked back up onto the roof ledge. Then he jumped off the building. Mist curled in the air around him. He burned steel, second of the basic elementic metals. Translucent blue lines sprang into existence around him, visible only to his eyes. Each one led from the center of his chest out to a nearby source of metal. The lines were all relatively faint, a sign that they pointed to metal sources that were small. Door hinges, nails, and other bits. The type of source metal didn't matter. Burning iron or steel would point blue lines at all kinds of metal, assuming they were close enough and large enough to be noticeable. Kelsier chose the line that pointed directly beneath him, toward his coin. Burning steel, he pushed against the coin. His descent immediately stopped, and he was thrown back up into the air in the opposite direction along the blue line. He reached out to the side, selected a passing window clasp, and pushed against it, angling himself to the side. The careful nudge sent him up and over the lip of the building directly across the street from Vin's lair. Kelsier landed with a lithe step, falling into a crouch and running across the building's peaked roof. He paused in the darkness at the other side, peering through the swirling air. He burned tin and felt it flare to life in his chest, enhancing his senses. Suddenly the mists seemed less deep. It wasn't that the night around him grew any lighter. His ability to perceive simply increased. In the distance to the north, he could just barely make out a large structure. Keep Venture. Kelsier left his tin on. It burned slowly, and he probably didn't need to worry about running out. As he stood, the mists curled slightly around his body. They twisted and spun, running in a slight, barely noticeable current beside him. The mists knew him. They claimed him. They could sense allomancy. He jumped, pushing against a metal chimney behind him, sending himself in a wide, horizontal leap. He tossed a coin even as he jumped, the tiny bit of metal flickering through the darkness and fog. He pushed against the coin before it hit the ground, the force of his weight driving it downward in a sharp motion. As soon as it hit the cobblestones, Kelsier's pushing forced him upward, turning the second half of his leap into a graceful arc. Kelsier landed on another peaked wooden rooftop. Steel pushing and iron pulling were the first things that Gemmel had taught him. "When you push on something, it's like you're throwing your weight against it," the old lunatic had said. "And you can't change how much you weigh. You're an allomancer, not some northern mystic. Don't pull on something that weighs less than you unless you want it to come flying at you. And don't push on something heavier than you unless you want to get tossed in the other direction." Kelsier scratched his scars, then pulled his mist cloak tight as he crouched on the roof, the wooden grain biting his unshod toes. He often wished that burning tin didn't enhance all of the senses, or at least not all of them at once. He needed the improved eyesight to see in the darkness, and he made good use of the improved hearing as well. However, burning tin made the night seem even more chilly to his overly sensitive skin, and his feet registered every pebble and wooden ripple they touched. Keep Venture rose before him. Compared with the murky city, the keep seemed to blaze with light. High nobles kept different schedules from regular people. The ability to afford, even squander, lamp oil and candles meant that the wealthy didn't have to bow before the whims of season or sun. The keep was majestic. That much was visible simply from the architecture. While it maintained a defensive wall around the grounds, the keep itself was more an artistic construction than fortification. Sturdy buttressings arced out from the sides, allowing for intricate windows and delicate spires. Brilliant stained glass windows stretched high along the sides of the rectangular building, and they shone with light from within, giving the surrounding mists a variegated glow. Kelsier burned iron, flaring it strong and searching the night for large sources of metal. He was too far away from the keep to use small items like coins or hinges. He'd need a larger anchor to cover this distance. Most of the blue lines were faint. Kelsier marked a couple of them, moving in a slow pattern up ahead. Probably a pair of guards standing on the rooftop. Kelsier would be sensing their breastplates and weapons. Despite allomantic considerations, most noblemen still armed their soldiers with metal. Mistings who could push or pull metals were uncommon, and full Mistborn were even more so. Many lords thought it impractical to leave one's soldiers and guards relatively defenseless in order to counter such a small segment of the population. No, most high noblemen relied on other means to deal with allomancers. Kelsier smiled. Dockson had said that Lord Venture kept a squad of haze killers. If that was true, Kelsier would probably meet them before the night was through. He ignored the soldiers for the moment, instead focusing on a solid line of blue pointing toward the keep's lofty top. It likely had bronze or copper sheeting on the roof. Kelsier flared his iron, took a deep breath, and pulled on the line. With a sudden jerk, he was yanked into the air. Kelsier continued to burn iron, pulling himself toward the keep at a tremendous speed. Some rumors claimed that Mistborn could fly, but that was a wistful exaggeration. Pulling and pushing against metals usually felt less like flying than it did like falling, only in the wrong direction. An allomancer had to pull hard in order to get the proper momentum, and this sent him hurtling toward his anchor at daunting speeds. Kelsier shot toward the keep, mists curling around him. He easily cleared the protective wall surrounding the keep's grounds, but his body dropped slightly toward the ground as he moved. It was his pesky weight again. It tugged him down. Even the swiftest of arrows angled slightly toward the ground as it flew. The drag of his weight meant that instead of shooting right up to the roof, he swung in an arc. He approached the keep wall several dozen feet below the rooftop, still traveling at a terrible speed. Taking a deep breath, Kelsier burned pewter, using it to enhance his physical strength much in the same way that tin enhanced his senses. He turned himself in the air, hitting the stone wall feet first. Even his strengthened muscles protested at the treatment, but he stopped without breaking any bones. He immediately released his hold on the roof, dropping a coin and pushing against it even as he began to fall. He reached out, selecting a source of metal above him, one of the wire housings of a stained glass window, and pulled on it. The coin hit the ground below and was suddenly able to support his weight. Kelsier launched himself upward, pushing on the coin and pulling on the window at the same time. Then, extinguishing both metals, he let momentum carry him the last few feet up through the dark mists. Cloak flapping quietly, he crested the lip of the keep's upper surface walkway, flipped himself over the stone railing, and landed quietly on the ledge. A startled guard stood not 3 paces away. Kelsier was upon the man in a second, jumping into the air, pulling slightly on the guard's steel breastplate, and throwing the man off balance. Kelsier whipped out one of his glass daggers, allowing the strength of his iron pull to bring him toward the guard. He landed with both feet against the man's chest, then crouched and sliced with a pewter-enhanced swing. The guard collapsed with a slit throat. Kelsier landed lithely beside him, ears straining in the night, listening for sounds of alarm. There were none. Kelsier left the guard to his gurgling demise. The man was likely a lesser nobleman, the enemy. If he were instead a Ska soldier, enticed into betraying his people in exchange for a few coins, well then Kelsier was even happier to send such men into their eternity. He pushed off the dying man's breastplate, hopping off the stone service walkway and onto the rooftop itself. The bronze roof was chill and slick beneath his feet. He scurried along it, heading toward the southern side of the building, looking for the balcony Dockson had mentioned. He wasn't too worried about being spotted. One purpose of this evening was to steal some atium, the 10th and most powerful of the generally known allomantic metals. His other purpose, however, was to cause a commotion. He found the balcony with ease. Wide and broad, it was probably a sitting balcony, used to entertain small groups. It was quiet at the moment, however, empty save for 2 guards. Kelsier crouched silently in the night mists above the balcony, furled gray cloak obscuring him, toes curling out over the side of the roof's metallic lip. The 2 guards chatted unwittingly below. Time to make a bit of noise. Kelsier dropped to the ledge directly between the guards. Burning pewter to strengthen his body, he reached out and fiercely steel-pushed against both men at the same time. Braced as he was at the center, his push threw the guards away in opposite directions. The men cried out in surprise as the sudden force threw them backward, hurling them over the balcony railing into the darkness beyond. The guards screamed as they fell. Kelsier threw open the balcony doors, letting a wall of mist fall inward around him, its tendrils creeping forward to claim the darkened room beyond. 3rd room in, Kelsier thought, moving forward in a crouching run. The 2nd room was a quiet, greenhouse-like conservatory. Low beds containing cultivated bushes and small trees ran through the room, and one wall was made up of enormous floor-to-ceiling windows to provide sunlight for the plants. Though it was dark, Kelsier knew that the plants would all be of slightly different colors than the typical brown. Some would be white, others ruddy, and perhaps even a few light yellow. Plants that weren't brown were a rarity, cultivated and kept by the nobility. Kelsier moved quickly through the conservatory. He paused at the next doorway, noting its lighted outline. He extinguished his tin, lest his enhanced eyes be blinded when he entered the lit room, and threw open the door. He ducked inside, blinking against the light, a glass dagger in each hand. The room, however, was empty. It was obviously a study. A lantern burned on each wall beside bookcases, and it had a desk in the corner. Kelsier replaced his knives, burning steel and searching for sources of metal. There was a large safe in the corner of the room, but it was too obvious. Sure enough, another strong source of metal shone from inside the eastern wall. Kelsier approached, running his fingers along the plaster. Like many walls in noble keeps, this one was painted with a soft mural. Foreign creatures lounged beneath a red sun. The false section of wall was under 2 feet square, and it had been placed so that its cracks were obscured by the mural. There's always another secret, Kelsier thought. He didn't bother trying to figure out how to open the contraption. He simply burned steel, reaching in and tugging against the weak source of metal that he assumed was the trapdoor's locking mechanism. It resisted at first, pulling him against the wall, but he burned pewter and yanked harder. The lock snapped and the panel swung open, revealing a small safe embedded in the wall. Kelsier smiled. It looked small enough for a pewter-enhanced man to carry, assuming he could get it out of the wall. He jumped up, iron pulling against the safe, and landed with his feet against the wall, 1 foot on either side of the open panel. He continued to pull, holding himself in place, and flared his pewter. Strength flooded his legs, and he flared steel as well, pulling against the safe. He strained, grunting slightly at the exertion. It was a test to see which would give out first, the safe or his legs. The safe shifted in its mountings. Kelsier pulled harder, muscles protesting. For an extended moment, nothing happened. Then the safe shook and ripped free of the wall. Kelsier fell backward, burning steel and pushing against the safe to get out of the way. He landed maladroitly, sweat dripping from his brow as the safe crashed to the wooden floor, throwing up splinters. A pair of startled guards burst into the room. About time, Kelsier noted, raising a hand and pulling on one of the soldiers' swords. It whipped out of its sheath, spinning in the air and streaking toward Kelsier point first. He extinguished his iron, stepping to the side and catching the sword by its hilt as momentum carried it past. "Mistborn!" the guard screamed. Kelsier smiled and jumped forward. The guard pulled out a dagger. Kelsier pushed it, tearing the weapon out of the man's hand, then swung, shearing the guard's head from his body. The second guard cursed, tugging free the release tie on his breastplate. Kelsier pushed on his own sword, even as he completed his swing. The sword ripped from his fingers and hissed directly toward the second guard. The man's armor dropped free, preventing Kelsier from pushing against it, just as the first guard's corpse fell to the ground. A moment later, Kelsier's sword planted itself in the second guard's now unarmored chest. The man stumbled quietly, then collapsed. Kelsier turned from the bodies, cloak rustling. His anger was quiet, not as fierce as it had been the night he'd killed Lord Tresting. But he felt it still, felt it in the itching of his scars and in the remembered screams of the woman he loved. As far as Kelsier was concerned, any man who upheld the final empire also forfeited his right to live. He flared his pewter, strengthening his body, then squatted down and lifted the safe. He teetered for a second beneath its weight, then got his balance and began to shuffle back toward the balcony. Perhaps the safe held atium, perhaps it didn't. However, he didn't have time to search out other options. He was halfway through the conservatory when he heard footsteps from behind. He turned to see the study flooding with figures. There were 8 of them, each one wearing a loose gray robe and carrying a dueling cane and a shield instead of a sword. Haze Killers. Kelsier let the safe drop to the ground. Haze Killers weren't allomancers, but they were trained to fight Mistings and Mistborn. There wouldn't be a single bit of metal on their bodies, and they would be ready for his tricks. Kelsier stepped back, stretching and smiling. The 8-man fanned into the study, moving with quiet precision. This should be interesting. The Haze Killers attacked, dashing by twos into the conservatory. Kelsier pulled out his daggers, ducking beneath the first attack and slicing at a man's chest. The Haze Killer jumped back, however, and forced Kelsier away with a swing of his cane. Kelsier flared his pewter, letting strengthened legs carry him back in a powerful jump. With one hand, he whipped out a handful of coins and pushed them against his opponents. The metal discs shot forward, zipping through the air, but his enemies were ready for this. They raised their shields, and the coins bounced off the wood, throwing up splinters but leaving the men unharmed. Kelsier eyed the other Haze Killers as they filled the room, advancing on him. They couldn't hope to fight him in an extended battle. Their tactic would be to rush him at once, hoping for a quick end to the fight, or to at least stall him until allomancers could be awakened and brought to the fight. He glanced at the safe as he landed. He couldn't leave without it. He needed to end the fight quickly as well. Flaring pewter, he jumped forward, trying an experimental dagger swipe. But he couldn't get inside his opponent's defenses. Kelsier barely ducked away in time to avoid getting cracked on the head by the end of a cane. 3 of the Haze Killers dashed behind him, cutting off his retreat into the balcony room. Great, Kelsier thought, trying to keep an eye on all 8 men at once. They advanced on him with careful precision, working as a team. Gritting his teeth, Kelsier flared his pewter again. It was running low, he noticed. Pewter was the fastest burning of the basic 8 metals. No time to worry about that now. The men behind him attacked, and Kelsier jumped out of the way, pulling on the safe to tug himself toward the center of the room. He pushed as soon as he hit the ground near the safe, launching himself into the air at an angle. He tucked, flipping over the heads of 2 attackers, and landed on the ground beside a well-cultivated tree bed. He spun, flaring his pewter and raising his arm in defense against the swing he knew would come. The dueling cane connected with his arm. A burst of pain ran down his forearm, but his pewter-enhanced bone held. Kelsier kept moving, driving his other hand forward and slamming a dagger into his opponent's chest. The man stumbled back in surprise, the motion ripping away Kelsier's dagger. A second Haze Killer attacked, but Kelsier ducked, then reached down with his free hand, ripping his coin pouch off of his belt. The Haze Killer prepared to block Kelsier's remaining dagger, but Kelsier raised his other hand instead, slamming the coin pouch into the man's shield. Then he pushed on the coins inside. The Haze Killer cried out, the force of the intense steel push throwing him backward. Kelsier flared his steel, pushing so hard that he tossed himself backward as well, away from the pair of men who had tried to attack him. Kelsier and his enemy flew away from each other, hurled in opposite directions. Kelsier collided with the far wall, but kept pushing, smashing his opponent, pouched shield and all, against one of the massive conservatory windows. Glass shattered, sparkles of lantern light from the study playing across its shards. The haze killer's desperate face disappeared into the darkness beyond, and mist, quiet yet ominous, began to creep in through the shattered window. The other 6 men advanced relentlessly, and Kelsier was forced to ignore the pain in his arm as he ducked 2 swings. He spun out of the way, brushing past a small tree, but a third haze killer attacked, smashing his cane into Kelsier's side. The attack threw Kelsier into the tree bed. He tripped, then collapsed near the entrance to the lit study, dropping his dagger. He gasped in pain, rolling to his knees and holding his side. The blow would have broken another man's ribs. Even Kelsier would have a massive bruise. The 6 men moved forward, spreading to surround him again. Kelsier stumbled to his feet, vision growing dizzy from pain and exertion. He gritted his teeth, reaching down and pulling out one of his remaining vials of metal. He downed his contents in a single gulp, replenishing his pewter, then burned tin. The light nearly blinded him, and the pain in his arm and side suddenly seemed more acute, but the burst of enhanced senses cleared his head. The 6 haze killers advanced in a sudden coordinated attack. Kelsier whipped his hand to the side, burning iron and searching for metal. The closest source was a thick, silvery paperweight on a desk just inside the study. Kelsier flipped it into his hand, then turned, arm held toward the advancing men, falling into an offensive stance. "All right," he growled. Kelsier burned steel with a flash of strength. The rectangular ingot ripped from his hand, streaking through the air. The foremost haze killer raised his shield, but he moved too slowly. The ingot hit the man's shoulder with a crunch, and he dropped, crying out. Kelsier spun to the side, ducking a staff swing and putting a haze killer between himself and the fallen man. He burned iron, pulling the ingot back toward him. It whipped through the air, cracking the second haze killer in the side of the head. The man collapsed as the ingot flipped into the air. One of the remaining men cursed, rushing forward to attack. Kelsier pushed the still airborne ingot, flipping it away from him, and away from the attacking haze killer, who had his shield raised. Kelsier heard the ingot hit the ground behind him, and he reached up, burning pewter, and caught the haze killer's cane mid-swing. The haze killer grunted, struggling against Kelsier's enhanced strength. Kelsier didn't bother trying to pull the weapon free. Instead, he pulled sharply on the ingot behind him, bringing it toward his own back at a deadly speed. He twisted at the last moment, using his momentum to spin the haze killer around, right into the ingot's path. The man dropped. Kelsier flared pewter, steadying himself against attacks. Sure enough, a cane smashed against his shoulders. He stumbled to his knees as the wood cracked, but flared tin kept him conscious. Pain and lucidity flashed through his mind. He pulled on the ingot, ripping it out of the dying man's back, and stepped to the side, letting the impromptu weapon shoot past him. The 2 haze killers nearest him crouched warily. The ingot snapped into one of the men's shields, but Kelsier didn't continue pushing lest he throw himself off balance. Instead, he burned iron, wrenching the ingot back toward himself. He ducked, extinguishing iron, and feeling the ingot whoosh through the air above him. There was a crack as it collided with the man who had been sneaking up on him. Kelsier spun, burning iron, then steel to send the ingot soaring toward the final 2 men. They stepped out of the way, but Kelsier tugged on the ingot, dropping it to the ground directly in front of them. The men regarded it warily, distracted as Kelsier ran and jumped, steel pushing himself against the ingot and flipping over the men's heads. The haze killers cursed, spinning. As Kelsier landed, he pulled the ingot again, bringing it up to smash into a man's skull from behind. The haze killer fell silently. The ingot flipped a few times in the darkness, and Kelsier snatched it from the air, its cool surface slick with blood. Mist from the shattered window flowed by his feet, curling up around his legs. He brought his hand down, pointing it directly at the last remaining haze killer. Somewhere in the room, a fallen man groaned. The remaining haze killer stepped back, then dropped his weapon and dashed away. Kelsier smiled, lowering his hand. Suddenly, the ingot was pushed from his fingers. It shot across the room, smashing through another window. Kelsier cursed, spinning to see another, larger group of men pouring into the study. They wore the clothing of noblemen, allomancers. Several of them raised hands, and a flurry of coins shot toward Kelsier. He flared steel, pushing the coins out of the way. Windows shattered and wood splintered as the room was sprayed with coins. Kelsier felt a tug on his belt as his final vial of metal was ripped away, pulled toward the other room. Several burly men ran forward in a crouch, staying beneath the shooting coins. Thugs. Mistings who, like Ham, could burn pewter. Time to go, Kelsier thought, deflecting another wave of coins, gritting his teeth against the pain in his side and arm. He glanced behind him. He had a few moments, but he was never going to make it back to the balcony. As more mistings advanced, Kelsier took a deep breath and dashed toward one of the broken floor-to-ceiling windows. He leapt out into the mists, turning in the air as he fell, and reached out to pull firmly on the fallen safe. He jerked in midair, swinging down toward the side of the building as if tied to the safe by a tether. He felt the safe slide forward, grinding against the floor of the conservatory as Kelsier's weight pulled against it. He slammed against the side of the building, but continued to pull, catching himself on the upper side of a windowsill. He strained, standing upside down in the window well, pulling on the safe. The safe appeared over the lip of the floor above. It teetered, then fell out the window and began to plummet directly toward Kelsier. He smiled, extinguishing his iron and pushing away from the building with his legs, throwing himself out into the mists like some insane diver. He fell backward through the darkness, barely catching sight of an angry face poking out of the broken window above. Kelsier pulled carefully against the safe, moving himself in the air. Mists curled around him, obscuring his vision, making him feel as if he weren't falling at all, but hanging in the middle of nothingness. He reached the safe, then twisted in the air and pushed against it, throwing himself upward. The safe crashed into the cobblestones just below. Kelsier pushed against the safe slightly, slowing himself, until he eventually jerked to a halt in the air just a few feet above the ground. He hung in the mists for a moment, ribbons from his cloak curling and flapping in the wind, then let himself drop to the ground beside the safe. The strongbox had been shattered by the fall. Kelsier pried open its mangled front, tin-enhanced ears listening to calls of alarm from the building above. Inside the safe, he found a small pouch of gemstones and a couple of 10,000 boxing letters of credit, all of which he pocketed. He felt around inside, suddenly worried that the night's work had been for naught. Then his fingers found it, a small pouch at the very back. He pulled it open, revealing a grouping of dark, bead-like bits of metal. Atium. His scars flared, memories of his time in the pits returning to him. He pulled the pouch tight and stood. With amusement, he noticed a twisted form lying on the cobblestones a short distance away, the mangled remains of the haze killer he'd thrown out the window. Kelsier walked over and retrieved his coin pouch with a tug of iron pulling. No, this night was not a waste. Even if he hadn't found the atium, any night that ended with a group of dead noblemen was a successful one in Kelsier's opinion. He gripped his pouch in one hand and the bag of atium in the other. He kept his pewter burning. Without the strength that lent his body, he'd probably collapse from the pain of his wounds, and dashed off into the night, heading toward Clubs' shop. I never wanted this, true, but somebody has to stop the deepness, and apparently, Terrace is the only place this can be done. On this fact, however, I don't have to take the word of the philosophers. I can feel our goal now, can sense it, though the others cannot. It pulses in my mind, far off in the mountains. 6. Vin awoke to a quiet room, red morning sunlight peeking through cracks in the shutters. She lay in bed for a moment, unsettled. Something felt wrong. It wasn't that she was waking up in an unfamiliar place. Traveling with Reen had accustomed her to a nomadic lifestyle. It took her a moment to realize the source of her discomfort. The room was empty. Not only was it empty, it was open, uncrowded, and it was comfortable. She lay on an actual mattress raised on posts, with sheets and a plush quilt. The room was decorated with a sturdy wooden armoire and even had a circular rug. Perhaps another might have found the room cramped and Spartan, but to Vin it seemed lavish. She sat up, frowning. It felt wrong to have a room all to herself. She had always been crammed into tight bunk rooms filled with crew members. Even while traveling, she had slept in beggars' alleys or rebel caves, and Reen had been there with her. She had always been forced to fight to find privacy. Being given it so easily seemed to devalue the years she had spent relishing her brief moments of solitude. She slipped out of bed, not bothering to open the shutters. The sunlight was faint, which meant it was still early morning, but she could already hear people moving in the hallway. She crept to the door, creaking it open and peeking out. After leaving Kelsier the night before, Dachshund had led Vin to Clubs' shop. Because of the late hour, Clubs had immediately led them to their separate rooms. Vin, however, had not gone to bed immediately. She had waited until everyone was asleep, then had snuck out to inspect her surroundings. The residence was almost more of an inn than it was a shop. Though it had a showroom below and a large workshop in the back, the building's second floor was dominated by several long hallways lined with guest rooms. There was a third floor, and the doors were more widely spaced there, implying larger rooms. She hadn't tapped for trapdoors or false walls. The noise might have awakened someone, but experience told her that it wouldn't be a proper lair if it didn't have at least a secret basement and some bolt holes. Overall, she was impressed. The carpentry equipment and half-finished projects below indicated a reputable working front. The lair was secure, well-stocked, and well-maintained. Watching through the crack in her door, Vin made out a group of about 6 groggy young men coming out of the hallway opposite her own. They wore simple clothing and made their way down the stairs toward the workroom. Apprentice carpenters, Vin thought. That's Clubs' front. He's a Ska craftsman. Most Ska lived lives of drudgery on the plantations. Even those who lived in a city were generally forced to do menial labor. However, some talented few were allowed a trade. They were still Ska. They were paid poorly and were always subject to the whims of the nobility. However, they had a measure of freedom that most Ska would envy. Clubs was probably a master carpenter. What would entice such a man, one who had, by Ska standards, an amazing life, to risk joining the underground? He is a misting, Vin thought. Kelsier and Dachshund called him a smoker. She would probably have to figure out what that meant on her own. Experience told her that a powerful man like Kelsier would withhold knowledge from her as long as he could, stringing her along with occasional tidbits. His knowledge was what bound her to him. It would be unwise to give away too much too quickly. Footsteps sounded outside, and Vin continued to peek through the crack. "You'll want to get ready, Vin," Dachshund said as he passed her door. He wore a nobleman's dress shirt and slacks, and he already looked awake and trim. He paused, continuing. "There's a fresh bath for you in the room at the end of the hallway, and I had Clubs scrounge you up a few changes of clothing. They should fit well enough until we can get you something more appropriate. Take your time in the bath. Kel's planned a meeting for this afternoon, but we can't start until Breeze and Ham arrive." Dachshund smiled, eyeing her through the cracked door, then continued on down the hallway. Vin flushed at being caught. These are observant men. I'm going to have to remember that. The hallway grew quiet. She slipped out her door and crept down to the indicated room, and was half surprised to find that there was indeed a warm bath waiting for her. She frowned, studying the tiled chamber and metal tub. The water smelled scented, after the fashion of noble ladies. These men are more like noblemen than Ska, Vin thought. She wasn't certain what she thought of that. However, they obviously expected her to do as they did, so she closed and bolted the door, then disrobed and crawled into the tub. She smelled funny. Even though the scent was faint, Vin still caught whiffs of herself occasionally. It was the smell of a passing noblewoman, the scent of a perfumed drawer opened by her brother's burgling fingers. The smell grew less noticeable as the morning progressed, but it still worried her. It would distinguish her from other Ska. If this crew expected her to take those baths regularly, she would have to request that the perfumes be removed. The morning meal was more up to her expectations. Several Ska women of various ages worked the shop's kitchen, preparing bay wraps, rolls of thin, flat bread, stuffed with boiled barley and vegetables. Vin stood by the kitchen doorway, watching the women work. None of them smelled like she did, though they were far more cleanly and well-groomed than average Ska. In fact, there was an odd sense of cleanliness to the entire building. She hadn't noticed it the night before because of the darkness, but the floor was scrubbed clean. All of the workers, kitchen women or apprentices, had clean faces and hands. It felt odd to Vin. She was accustomed to her own fingers being black with ash stains. With Reen, if she'd ever washed her face, she had quickly rubbed it with ash again. A clean face stood out on the streets. No ash in the corners, she thought, eyeing the floor. The room is swept. She'd never lived in such a place before. It was almost like living in some nobleman's house. She glanced back at the kitchen women. They wore simple dresses of white and gray, with scarves around the tops of their heads and long tails of hair hanging out the back. Vin fingered her own hair. She kept it short, like a boy's. Her current ragged cut had been given by one of the other crew members. She wasn't like these women. She never had been. By Reen's command, Vin had lived so that other crew members would think of her as a thief first, and a girl second. But what am I now? Perfumed by her bath, yet wearing the tan trousers and buttoning shirt of an apprentice craftsman, she felt distinctly out of place. And that was bad. If she felt awkward, then she undoubtedly looked awkward too. Something else to make her stand out. Vin turned, eyeing the workroom. The apprentices were already about their morning labors, working on various bits of furniture. They stayed in the back while clubs worked in the main showroom, putting detailed finishing touches on the pieces. The back kitchen door suddenly slammed open. Vin slipped reflexively to the side, putting her back to a wall and peeking around into the kitchen. Ham stood in the kitchen doorway, framed by red sunlight. He wore a loose shirt and vest, both sleeveless, and carried several large packs. He wasn't dirtied by soot. None of the crew had ever been, the few times Vin had seen them. Ham walked through the kitchen and into the workroom. "So," he said, dropping his packs, "anyone know which room is mine?" "I'll ask Master Cladent," one of the apprentices said, moving into the front room. Ham smiled, stretching, then turned toward Vin. "Morning, Vin. You know, you don't have to hide from me. We're on the same team." Vin relaxed, but remained where she was, standing beside a line of mostly finished chairs. "You're going to live here too?" "It always pays to stay near the smoker," Ham said, turning and disappearing back into the kitchen. He returned a moment later with a stack of 4 large bay wraps. "Anyone know where Kel is?" "Sleeping," Vin said. "He came in late last night and hasn't gotten up yet." Ham grunted, taking a bite of the bay wrap. "Doc's?" "In his room on the 3rd floor," Vin said. "He got up early, came down to get something to eat, and went back upstairs." She didn't add that she knew, from peeking through the keyhole, that he was sitting at his desk, scribbling on some papers. Ham raised an eyebrow. "You always keep track of where everyone is like that?" "Yes." Ham paused, then chuckled. "You're an odd kid, Vin." He gathered up his packs as the apprentice returned, and the two moved up the stairs. Vin stood, listening to their footsteps. They stopped about halfway down the first hallway, perhaps a few doors from her room. The scent of steamed barley enticed her. Vin eyed the kitchen. Ham had gone in and taken food. Was she allowed to do the same? Trying to look confident, Vin strode into the kitchen. A pile of bay wraps sat on a platter. probably to be delivered to the apprentices as they worked. Vin picked up 2 of them. None of the women objected. In fact, a few of them even nodded respectfully toward her. I'm an important person now, she thought with a measure of discomfort. Did they know that she was Mistborn? Or was she simply treated with respect because she was a guest? Eventually, Vin took a 3rd bay wrap and fled to her room. It was more food than she could possibly eat. However, she intended to scrape out the barley and save the flatbread, which would keep well should she need it later. A knock came at her door. Vin answered it, pulling the door open with a careful motion. A young man stood outside. The boy who had been with Clubs back at Cayman's lair the night before. Thin, tall, and awkward-looking, he was dressed in gray clothing. He was perhaps 14, though his height might have made him look older than he was. He seemed nervous for some reason. Yes? Vin asked. Vin frowned. What? You wanted, he said in a thick Eastern accent. Up's in the weir above with the doing. With Master Jax to the 3rd floor. I gotta go. The boy blushed, then turned and hurried away, scrambling up the stairs. Vin stood in the doorway of her room, dumbfounded. Was that supposed to make any sense? She wondered. She peeked into the hallway. The boy had seemed like he expected her to follow him. Finally, she decided to do so, carefully making her way up the steps. Voices were coming from an open door at the end of the hallway. Vin approached and peeked around the corner to find a well-decorated room, set with a fine rug and comfortable-looking chairs. A hearth burned at the side of the room, and the chairs were arranged to point toward a large charcoal writing board set atop an easel. Kelsier stood, leaning one elbow resting against the brick hearth, a cup of wine in his hand. Angling herself slightly, Vin could see that he was talking to Breeze. The soother had arrived well into midday and had appropriated half of Clubs' apprentices to unload his possessions. Vin had watched from her window as the apprentices had carried the luggage, disguised as boxes of lumber scraps, up to Breeze's room. Breeze himself hadn't bothered to help. Am was there, as was Doxson, and Clubs was settling himself into the large overstuffed chair farthest from Breeze. The boy who had fetched Vin sat on a stool beside Clubs, and he was obviously making a point of trying not to look at her. The final occupied chair held the man Yeadon, dressed, as before, in common Ska worker's clothing. He sat in his chair without resting against its back, as if he disapproved of its plushness. His face was darkened with soot, as Vin expected of a Ska worker. There were 2 empty chairs. Kelsier noticed Vin standing by the doorway and gave her one of his inviting smiles. Well, there she is. Come in. Vin scanned the room. There was a window, though its shutters were closed against approaching gloom. The only chairs were the ones in Kelsier's half-circle. Resigned, she moved forward and took the empty chair beside Doxson. It was too big for her, and she settled into it with her knees folded beneath her. That's all of us, Kelsier said. Who's the last chair for? Ham asked. Kelsier smiled, winked, but ignored the question. All right, let's talk. We've got something of a task ahead of ourselves, and the sooner we begin outlining a plan, the better. I thought you had a plan, Eden said uncomfortably. I have a framework, Kelsier said. I know what needs to happen, and I have a few ideas on how to do it. But you don't gather a group like this and just tell them what to do. We need to work this out together, beginning with a list of problems we need to deal with if we want the plan to work. Well, Ham said, let me get the framework straight first. The plan is to gather Eden an army, cause chaos in Luthadel, secure the palace, steal the Lord Ruler's Atium, then leave the government to collapse? Essentially, Kelsier said. Then, Ham said, our main problem is the garrison. If we want chaos in Luthadel, then we can't have 20,000 troops here to keep the peace. Not to mention the fact that Eden's troops will never take the city while there is any sort of armed resistance on the walls. Kelsier nodded. Picking up a piece of chalk, he wrote, Luthadel Garrison up on the board. What else? We'll need a way to make said chaos in Luthadel, Breeze said, gesturing with a cup of wine. Your instincts are right, my dear man. This city is where the Ministry makes its headquarters and the great houses run their mercantile empires. We'll need to bring Luthadel down if we want to break the Lord Ruler's ability to govern. Mentioning the nobility brings up another point, Doxson added. The great houses all have guard forces in the city, not to mention their allomancers. If we're going to deliver the city to Eden, we'll have to deal with those noblemen. Kelsier nodded, writing Chaos and Great Houses beside Luthadel Garrison on his board. The Ministry, Club said, leaning back in his plush chair so much that Vin almost couldn't see his grumpy face. There'll be no change in government as long as the Steel Inquisitors have anything to say about it. Kelsier added Ministry to the board. What else? Atium, Ham said. We might as well write it up there. We'll need to secure the palace quickly, once General Mayhem starts, and make certain nobody else takes the opportunity to slip into the treasury. Kelsier nodded, writing Atium, secure treasury, on the board. We will need to find a way to gather Eden's troops, Breeze added. We have to be quiet, but quick, and train them somewhere that the Lord Ruler won't find them. We also might want to make certain that the Ska Rebellion is ready to take control of Luthadel, Doxson added. Seizing the palace and digging in will make for a spectacular story, but it would be nice if Eden and his people were actually ready to govern once this is all over. Troops and Ska Rebellion were added to the board. And, Kelsier said, I'm going to add Lord Ruler. We'll at least want a plan to get him out of the city, should other options fail. After writing Lord Ruler on the list, he turned back toward the group. Did I forget anything? Well, Eden said dryly, if you're listing problems we'll have to overcome, you should write up there that we're all bloody insane. Though I doubt we can fix that fact. The group chuckled, and Kelsier wrote Eden's bad attitude on the board. Then he stepped back, looking over the list. When you break it down like that, it doesn't look so bad, does it? Vin frowned, trying to decide if Kelsier was attempting a joke or not. The list wasn't just daunting, it was disturbing. 20,000 Imperial soldiers, the collected forces and power of the high nobility, the Ministry. One Steel Inquisitor was said to be more powerful than 1,000 troops. More discomforting, however, was how matter-of-factly they regarded the issues. How could they even think of resisting the Lord Ruler? He was... well, he was the Lord. He ruled all of the world. He was the creator, protector, and punisher of mankind. He had saved them from the deepness, then had brought the ash and the mists as a punishment for the people's lack of faith. Vin wasn't particularly religious. Intelligent thieves knew how to avoid the Steel Ministry, but even she knew the legends. And yet, the group regarded their list of problems with determination. There was a grim mirth about them, as if they understood that they had a better chance of making the sun rise at night than they did of overthrowing the final empire. Yet they were still going to try. By the Lord Ruler, Vin whispered, you're serious. You really mean to do this? Don't use his name as an oath, Vin, Kelsier said. Even blasphemy honors him. When you curse by that creature's name, you acknowledge him as your god. Vin fell silent, sitting back in her chair, a bit numb. Anyway, Kelsier said, smiling lightly. Anyone have any ideas on how to overcome these problems? Besides Eden's attitude, of course. We all know he's hopeless. The room was quiet and thoughtful. Thoughts? Kelsier asked. Angles? Impressions? Breeze shook his head. Now that it's all up there, I can't help wondering if the child has a point. This is a daunting task. But it can be done, Kelsier said. Let's start by talking about how to break the city. What can we do that would be so threatening that it would throw the nobility into chaos? Maybe even get the palace guard out into the city, exposing them to our troops. Something that would distract the ministry and the Lord Ruler himself while we move our troops in to attack. Well, a general revolution among the populace comes to mind, Ham said. Won't work, Eden said firmly. Why not? Ham asked. You know how the people are treated. They live in slums, work in mills and smithies the entire day, and half of them still starve. Eden shook his head. Don't you understand? The rebellion has been trying for 1,000 years to get the Ska in this city to rise up. It never works. They're too beaten down. They don't have the will or the hope to resist. That's why I had to come to you to get an army. The room fell still. Vin, however, slowly nodded her head. She'd seen it. She'd felt it. One didn't fight the Lord Ruler. Even living as a thief, crouching at the edge of society, she knew that. There would be no rebellion. He's right, I'm afraid, Kelsier said. The Ska won't rise up, not in their current state. If we're going to overthrow this government, we'll need to do it without the help of the masses. We can probably recruit our soldiers from among them, but we can't count on the general populace. Could we cause a disaster of some sort? Ham asked. A fire, maybe? Kelsier shook his head. It might disrupt trade for a while, but I doubt it would have the effect we want. Besides, the cost in Ska lives would be too high. The slums would burn, not stone nobleman keeps. Breeze sighed. What then would you have us do? Kelsier smiled, eyes twinkling. What if we turned the great houses against each other? Breeze paused. A house war, he said, taking a speculative sip of his wine. It's been a while since the city had one of those. Which means that tensions have had plenty of time to brew, Kelsier said. The high nobility are growing increasingly powerful. The Lord Ruler barely has control over them anymore, which is why we have a chance of shattering his grip. Luthadell's great houses are the key. They control imperial trade, not to mention enslave the greatest majority of the Ska. Kelsier pointed at the board, moving his finger between the line that said chaos and the line that said great houses. If we can turn the houses inside Luthadel against each other, we can bring down the city. Mistborn will start assassinating house leaders. Fortunes will collapse. It won't take long before there is open warfare in the streets. Part of our contract with Eden states that we'll give him an opening to seize the city for himself. Can you think of a better one than that? Breeze nodded with a smile. It has flair, and I do like the idea of having the noblemen kill each other. You always like it better when someone else does the work, Breeze, Ham noted. My dear friend, Breeze replied, the entire point of life is to find ways to get others to do your work for you. Don't you know anything about basic economics? Ham raised an eyebrow. Actually, It was a rhetorical question, Ham, Breeze interrupted, rolling his eyes. Those are the best kind, Ham replied. Philosophy later, Ham, Kelsier said. Stay on task. What do you think of my suggestion? It could work, Ham said, settling back. But I can't see the Lord Ruler letting things go that far. It's our job to see that he doesn't have a choice, Kelsier said. He's known to let his nobility squabble, probably to keep them off balance. We fan those tensions, then somehow force the garrison to pull out. When the houses start fighting in earnest, the Lord Ruler won't be able to do anything to stop them. Except perhaps send his palace guard into the streets, which is exactly what we want him to do. He could also send for a Kolos army, Ham noted. True, Kelsier said. But they're stationed a moderate distance away. That's a flaw we need to exploit. Kolos troops make wonderful grunts, but they have to be kept away from civilized cities. The very center of the final empire is exposed, yet the Lord Ruler is confident in his strength. And why shouldn't he be? He hasn't faced a serious threat in centuries. Most cities only need small policing forces. 20,000 men is hardly a small number, Breeze said. It is on a national scale, Kelsier said, holding up a finger. The Lord Ruler keeps most of his troops on the edges of his empire, where the threat of rebellion is strongest. That's why we're going to strike him here, in Luthadel itself. And that's why we're going to succeed. Assuming we can deal with that garrison, Dockson noted. Kelsier nodded, turning to write House War underneath Great Houses and Chaos. All right then, let's talk about the garrison. What are we going to do about it? Well, Ham said speculatively, historically, the best way to deal with a large force of soldiers is to have your own large force of soldiers. We're going to raise Eden an army. Why not let them attack the garrison? Isn't that kind of the point of raising the army in the first place? That won't work, Breeze said. He regarded his empty cup of wine, then held it up toward the boy sitting beside Clubs, who immediately scurried over to refill it. If we wanted to defeat the garrison, Breeze continued, we'd need our own force of at least its same size. We'd probably want one larger, since our men will be newly trained. We might be able to raise Eden an army. We might even be able to get him one large enough to hold the city for a while. But getting him one large enough to take on the garrison inside its fortifications? We might as well give up now if that's our plan. The group fell silent. Vin squirmed in her chair, looking over each man in turn. Breeze's words had a profound effect. Ham opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, sitting back to reconsider. All right, Kelsier finally said. We'll get back to the garrison in a moment. Let's look at our own army. How can we raise one of substantial size and hide it from the Lord Ruler? Again, that will be difficult, Breeze said. There is a very good reason why the Lord Ruler feels safe in the Central Dominance. There are constant patrols on the roadways and canals, and you can hardly spend a day traveling without running into a village or plantation. This isn't the sort of place where you can raise an army without attracting notice. The rebellion has those caves up to the north, Dockson said. We might be able to hide some men there. Eden paled. You know about the Argois caverns? Kelsier rolled his eyes. Even the Lord Ruler knows about them, Eden. The rebels there just aren't dangerous enough to bother him yet. How many people do you have, Eden? Ham asked. In Luthadel and around it, caves included. What do we have to start with? Eden shrugged. Maybe 300, including women and children. And how many do you think those caves could hide? Ham asked. Eden shrugged again. The caves could support a larger group for certain, Kelsier said. Perhaps 10,000. I've been there. The rebellion has been hiding people in them for years. The Lord Ruler has never bothered to destroy them. I can imagine why, Ham said. Cave fighting is nasty business, especially for the aggressor. The Lord Ruler likes to keep defeats to a minimum. He's nothing if not vain. Anyway, 10,000. That's a decent number. They could hold the palace with ease. Maybe even be able to hold the city, if it had the walls. Dockson turned to Eden. When you asked for an army, what size were you thinking? 10,000 sounds like a good number, I suppose, Eden said. Actually, it's a bit larger than I was thinking. Breeze tipped his cup slightly, swirling the wine. I hate to sound contrary again, that's usually Hammond's job, but I do have to return to our earlier problem. 10,000 men. That won't even frighten the garrison. We're talking about 20,000 well-armed, well-trained troops. He has a point, Cal, Dockson said. He had found a small book somewhere and had begun taking notes on the meeting. Kelsier frowned. Ham nodded. Any way you look at it, Kel, that garrison is going to be a tough stone to break. Perhaps we should just focus on the nobility. Maybe we can cause enough chaos that even the garrison won't be able to suppress it. Kelsier shook his head. Doubtful. The garrison's primary duty is to maintain order in the city. If we can't deal with those troops, we'll never pull this off. He paused, then eyed Vin. What do you think, Vin? Any suggestions? She froze. Cayman had never asked her opinion. What did Kelsier want from her? She pulled back into her chair slightly as she realized that the other members of the crew had turned, looking at her. Vin said slowly. Oh, don't intimidate the poor thing, Kelsier, Breeze said with a wave of his hand. Vin nodded, but Kelsier didn't turn away from her. No, really. Tell me what you're thinking, Vin. You've got a much larger enemy threatening you. What do you do? Well, she said slowly, you don't fight him, that's for certain. Even if you won somehow, you'd be so hurt and broken that you couldn't fight off anyone else. Makes sense, Dockson said. But we might not have a choice. We have to get rid of that army somehow. And if it just left the city? She asked. That would work too? If I had to deal with someone big, I'd try and distract him first. Get him to leave me alone. Ham chuckled. Good luck getting the garrison to leave Luthadel. The Lord Ruler sends squads out on patrol sometimes, but the only time I know of the entire garrison leaving was when that Ska rebellion broke out down in Coeur d'Alene a half-century ago. Dockson shook his head. Vin's idea is too good to dismiss that easily, I think. Really, we can't fight the garrison, so we need to get them to leave the city somehow. Yes, Breeze said, but it would take a particular crisis to require involving the garrison. If the problem weren't threatening enough, the Lord Ruler wouldn't send the entire garrison. If it were too dangerous, he'd hunker down and send for his Koloss. A rebellion in one of the nearby cities? Ham suggested. That leaves us with the same problem as before, Kelsier said, shaking his head. If we can't get the Ska here to rebel, we'll never get ones outside the city to do so. What about a feint of some sort, then? Ham asked. We're assuming that we'll be able to raise a sizable group of soldiers. If they pretend to attack someplace nearby, perhaps the Lord Ruler would send the garrison out to help. I doubt he'd send away to protect another city, Breeze said. Not if it left him exposed in Luthadel. The group fell silent, thinking again. Vin glanced around, then found Kelsier's eyes on her. What? He asked. She squirmed a bit, glancing down. How far away are the pits of Hath-Sin? She finally asked. The crew paused. Finally, Breeze laughed. Oh, now that's devious. The nobility don't know that the pits produce atium, so the Lord Ruler couldn't make much of a fuss. Not without revealing that there's something very special about those pits. That means no Koloss. They wouldn't arrive in time anyway, Ham said. The pits are only a couple of days away. If they were threatened, the Lord Ruler would have to respond quickly. The garrison would be the only force in striking distance. Kelsier smiled, eyes alight. And it wouldn't take much of an army to threaten the pits either. 1,000 men could do it. We send them to attack, then when the garrison leaves, we march our second larger force in and seize Luthadel itself. By the time the garrison realize that they've been duped, they wouldn't be able to get back in time to stop us from taking the city walls. Could we keep them, though? Eden asked apprehensively. Ham nodded eagerly. With 10,000 Ska, I could hold this city against the garrison. The Lord Ruler would have to send for his Koloss. By then, we'd have the atium, Kelsier said. And the great houses won't be in any position to stop us. They'll be weakened and frail because of their internal fighting. Dockson was scribbling furiously on his pad. We'll need to use Eden's caves, then. They're within striking distance of both our targets. And they're closer to Luthadel than the pits are. If our army left from there, it could get here before the garrison could return from the pits. Kelsier nodded. Dachshund continued to scribble. I'll have to start stockpiling supplies in those caves. Maybe make a trip out to check conditions there. And how are we going to get the soldiers there? Eden asked. That's a week outside the city, and Scar aren't allowed to travel on their own. I've already got someone who can help us there, Kelsier said, writing attack pits of Hath Sin beneath Luthadel garrison on his board. I have a friend that can give us a front to run canal boats to the north. Assuming, Eden said, you can even make good on your first and primary promise. I paid you to gather me an army. 10,000 men is a great number, but I've still to see an adequate explanation of how you're going to raise them. I've already told you the kinds of problems we've had trying to recruit in Luthadel. We won't need the general population to support us, Kelsier said. Just a small percentage of them. There are nearly 1 million workers in and around Luthadel. This should actually be the easiest part of the plan, since we happen to be in the presence of one of the world's greatest soothers. Breeze, I'm counting on you and your Allomancers to force us up a nice selection of recruits. Breeze sipped his wine. Kelsier, my good man, I wish you wouldn't use words like force in reference to my talents. I simply encourage people. Well, can you encourage us up an army? Dachshund asked. How much time do I have? Breeze asked. 1 year, Kelsier said. We'll plan this to go off next fall. Assuming the Lord Ruler does gather his forces to attack Eden once we attack the city, we might as well make him do it in the winter. 10,000 men? Breeze said with a smile. Gathered from a resistant population in less than 1 year. It would certainly be a challenge. Kelsier chuckled. From you? That's as good as a yes. Start in Luthadel, then move to the surrounding cities. We need people who are close enough to gather at the caves. Breeze nodded. We'll also need weapons and supplies, Ham said. And we'll need to train the men. I've already got a plan to get weapons, Kelsier said. Can you find some men to do the training? Ham paused thoughtfully. Probably. I know some Scar soldiers who fought in one of the Lord Ruler's suppression campaigns. Eden hated. Traitors! Ham shrugged. Most of them aren't proud of what they did, he said. But most of them also like to eat. It's a hard world, Eden. My people will never work with such men, Eden said. They'll have to, Kelsier said sternly. A large number of Scar rebellions fail because their men are poorly trained. We're going to give you an army of well-equipped, well-fed men, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let you get them slaughtered because they were never taught which end of a sword to hold. Kelsier paused, then eyed Ham. However, I do suggest that you find men who are bitter against the Final Empire for what it forced them to do. I don't trust men whose loyalty only goes as far as the boxings in their pockets. Ham nodded, and Eden quieted. Kelsier turned, writing Ham, training, and Breeze, recruitment, beneath troops on the board. I'm interested in your plan to get weapons, Breeze said. How exactly do you intend to arm 10,000 men without making the Lord Ruler suspicious? He keeps a very careful eye on the armament flows. We could make the weapons, Clubs said. I have enough extra wood that we could churn out a war staff or 2 every day. Probably get you some arrows, too. I appreciate the offer, Clubs, Kelsier said, and I think that's a good idea. However, we're going to need more than staves. We'll need swords, shields, and armor. And we need them quickly enough to begin training. How then are you going to do it? Breeze asked. The great houses can get weapons, Kelsier said. They don't have any problems arming their personal retinues. You want us to steal from them? Kelsier shook his head. No. For once, we're going to do things somewhat legally. We're going to buy our weapons. Or rather, we're going to have a sympathetic nobleman buy them for us. Clubs laughed bluntly. A nobleman sympathetic to the Scar? It will never happen. Well, never happened a short time ago then, Kelsier said lightly, because I've already found someone to help us. The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fireplace. Vin squirmed slightly in her chair, glancing at the others. They seemed shocked. "Who?" Ham asked. "His name is Lord Renew," Kelsier said. "He arrived in the area a few days back. He's staying in Feliz. He doesn't quite have enough influence to establish himself in Luthadel. Besides, I think it's prudent to keep Renew's activities a bit removed from the Lord Ruler." Vin cocked her head. Feliz was a small suburb-style city an hour outside of Luthadel. She and Reen had worked there before moving into the capital city. How had Kelsier recruited this Lord Renew? Had he bribed the man, or was it some sort of scam? "I know of Renew," Breeze said slowly. "He's a Western lord. He has a great deal of power and the foremost dominance." Kelsier nodded. Lord Renew recently decided to try and elevate his family to high noble status. His official story is that he came south in order to expand his mercantile efforts. He hopes that by shipping fine southern weaponry to the north, he can earn enough money and make enough connections to build himself a keep in Luthadel by the end of the decade. The room was quiet. "But," Ham said slowly, "those weapons will be coming to us instead." Kelsier nodded. "We'll have to fake the shipping records, just in case." "That's quite an ambitious front, Kel," Ham said. "The Lord's family working on our side." "But," Breeze said, looking confused, "Kelsier, you hate noblemen." "This one's different," Kelsier said with a sly smile. The crew studied Kelsier. They didn't like working with a nobleman. Vin could tell that much easily. It probably didn't help that Renew was so powerful. Suddenly, Breeze laughed. He leaned back in his chair, downing the last of his wine. "You blessed madman. You killed him, didn't you? Renew, you killed him and replaced him with an imposter." Kelsier's smile broadened. Eden cursed, but Ham simply smiled. "Ah, now that makes sense. Or at least it makes sense if you're Kelsier the Foolhardy." "Renew is going to take up permanent residence in Feliz," Kelsier said. "He'll be our front if we need to do anything official. I'll use him to purchase armaments and supplies, for instance." Breeze nodded thoughtfully. "Efficient."
"Efficient?" Eden asked. "You killed a nobleman. A very important one."
"You're planning to overthrow the entire empire, Eden," Kelsier noted. "Renew isn't going to be the last aristocratic casualty in this little endeavor."
"Yes, but impersonating him?" Eden asked. "That sounds a little risky to me."
"You hired us because you wanted extraordinary results, my dear man," Breeze said, sipping his wine. "In our line of work, extraordinary results usually require extraordinary risks." "We minimize them as best we can, Eden," Kelsier said. "My actor is very good. However, these are the sorts of things we're going to be doing in this job."
"And if I order you to stop a few of them?" Eden asked.
"You can shut down the job at any time," Dockson said, not looking up from his ledgers. "But as long as it is in motion, Kelsier has final say on plans, objectives, and procedures. That is how we work. You knew that when you hired us." Eden shook his head ruefully. "Well," Kelsier asked, "do we continue or not? The call is yours, Eden." "Feel free to call an end to it, friend," Breeze said with a helpful voice. "Don't be afraid of offending us. I, for one, look favorably upon free money." Vin saw Eden pale slightly. In Vin's estimation, he was fortunate that Kelsier hadn't simply taken his money and stabbed him in the chest. but she was becoming increasingly convinced that wasn't the way things worked around here.
This is insane, Eden said.
Trying to overthrow the Lord Ruler? Breeze asked. Why, yes, as a matter of fact, it is.
All right, Eden said, sighing. We continue.
Good, Kelsier said, writing Kelsier Equipment under troops. The Renew Front will also give us an in with Luthadel High Society. This will be a very important advantage. We'll need to keep careful track of Great House politics if we're going to start a war. This house war might not be as easy to pull off as you think, Kelsier, Breeze warned. The current lot of high noblemen is a careful, discriminating group. Kelsier smiled. Then it's good that you're here to help, Breeze. You're an expert at making people do what you want. Together, you and I will plan how to make the high nobility turn on each other. Major house wars seem to happen every couple of centuries or so. The current group's competence will only make them more dangerous, so getting them riled up shouldn't be that hard. In fact, I've already started the process. Breeze raised an eyebrow, then glanced at Ham. The thug grumbled a bit, pulling out a golden 10 boxing coin and flipping it across the room to the self-satisfied Breeze. What was that about? Doxson asked. We had a bet, Breeze said, regarding whether or not Kelsier was involved in last night's disturbance.
Disturbance? Eden asked. What disturbance?
Someone attacked House Venture, Ham said. The rumors claim that 3 full Mistborn were sent to assassinate Straff Venture himself. Kelsier snorted. 3? Straff certainly has an elevated opinion of himself. I didn't go anywhere near his lordship. I was there for the Atium, and to make certain that I was seen. Venture isn't sure who to blame, Breeze said. But because Mistborn were involved, everyone assumes that it was one of the great houses. That was the idea, Kelsier said happily. The high nobility take Mistborn attacks very seriously. They have an unspoken agreement that they won't use Mistborn to assassinate each other. A few more strikes like this, and I'll have them snapping at each other like frightened animals. He turned, adding Breeze, planning, and Kelsier, general mayhem, beneath great houses on the board. Anyway, Kelsier continued, we'll need to keep an eye on local politics to find out which houses are making alliances. That means sending a spy to some of their functions.
Is that really necessary?
Eden asked uncomfortably. Ham nodded. It's standard procedure for any Luthadel job, actually. If there's information to be had, it will pass through the lips of the courts powerful. It always pays to keep an open set of ears moving through their circles. Well, that should be easy, Breeze said. We just bring up your imposter and send him into the parties. Kelsier shook his head. Unfortunately, Lord Renew himself won't be able to come to Luthadel. Eden frowned.
Why not? Won't your imposter hold up to close scrutiny?
Oh, he looks just like Lord Renew, Kelsier said. Exactly like Lord Renew, actually. We just can't let him get near an Inquisitor. Ah, Breeze said, exchanging a glance with Ham. One of those. Well then.
What?
Eden asked.
What does he mean?
You don't want to know, Breeze said.
I don't?
Breeze shook his head. You know how unsettled you just were when Kelsier said he'd replaced Lord Renew with an imposter? Well, this is about a dozen times worse. Trust me, the less you know, the more comfortable you'll be. Eden looked toward Kelsier, who was smiling broadly. Eden paled, then leaned back in his chair.
I think you're probably right.
Vin frowned, eyeing the others in the room. They seemed to know what Kelsier was talking about. She'd have to study this Lord Renew sometime. Anyway, Kelsier said, we have to send someone to the social functions. Dox, therefore, will be playing Renew's nephew and heir, a scion of the family who has recently gained favor with Lord Renew.
Wait a moment, Cal, Doxson said. You didn't tell me about this. Kelsier shrugged. We're going to need someone to be our dupe with the nobility. I assumed that you'd fit the role. Can't be me, Doxson said. I got marked during the ICER job just a couple months back. Do I want to know what they're talking about this time? He means that the Ministry is watching for him, Breeze said. He pretended to be a nobleman and they found out. Doxson nodded. The Lord Ruler himself saw me on one occasion, and he's got a flawless memory. Even if I manage to avoid him, someone's bound to recognize me eventually. So, Eden said. So, Kelsier said, we'll need someone else to play Lord Renew's heir. Don't look at me, Eden said apprehensively. Trust me, Kelsier said flatly. Nobody has. Clubs is out too. He's far too prominent a local scar craftsman. I'm out as well, Breeze said. I already have several aliases among the nobility. I suppose I could use one of them, but I couldn't go to any major balls or parties. It would be rather embarrassing if I met someone who knew me by a different alias. Kelsier frowned thoughtfully. I could do it, Ham said. But you know I'm no good at acting. What about my nephew? Club said, nodding to the young man at his side. Kelsier studied the boy. What's your name, son? Lestibonis. Kelsier raised an eyebrow. That's a mouthful. You don't have a nickname? Not of the Yetting yet. We'll have to work on that, Kelsier said. Do you always speak in that Eastern street slang? The boy shrugged, obviously nervous at being such a center of attention. Was in the place when I was young. Kelsier glanced at Doxson, who shook his head. I don't think it's a good idea, Kel. Agreed. Kelsier turned to Vin, then smiled. I guess that leaves you. How good are you at imitating a noblewoman? Vin paled slightly. My brother gave me a few lessons, but I've never actually tried to. You'll do fine, Kelsier said, writing Vin infiltration under great houses. All right. Eden, you should probably begin planning how you're to keep control of the Empire once this is all through. Eden nodded. Vin felt a little sorry for the man, seeing how much the planning, the sheer outrageousness of it all, seemed to be overwhelming him. Still, it was hard to feel sympathy for him, considering what Kelsier had just said regarding her part in all this. Playing a noblewoman, she thought. Surely there's someone else who could do a better job. Breeze's attention was still on Eden and his obvious discomfort. Don't look so solemn, my dear fellow, Breeze said. Why, you'll probably never actually have to rule the city. Chances are we'll all get caught and executed long before that happens. Eden smiled wanly. And if we don't? What's to keep you all from just knifing me and taking the Empire for yourselves? Breeze rolled his eyes. We're thieves, my dear man, not politicians. A nation is far too unwieldy a commodity to be worth our time. Once we have our atium, we'll be happy. Not to mention rich, Ham added. The two words are synonyms, Hammond, Breeze said. Besides, Kelsier said to Eden, we won't be giving you the entire Empire. Hopefully it will shatter once Luthadel destabilizes. You'll have this city and probably a good piece of the central dominance, assuming you can bribe the local armies into supporting you. And the Lord Ruler? Eden asked. Kelsier smiled. I'm still planning to deal with him personally. I just have to figure out how to make the 11th metal work. And if you don't? Well, Kelsier said, writing Eden, Preparation and Rule beneath Ska Rebellion on the board. We'll try and find a way to trick him out of the city. Perhaps we can get him to go with his army to the pits and secure things there. Then what? Eden asked. You find some way to deal with him, Kelsier said.
You didn't hire us to kill the Lord Ruler, Eden. That's just a possible perk I intend to throw in if I can.
I wouldn't worry too much, Eden, Ham added. He won't be able to do much without funds or armies. He's a powerful allomancer, but by no means omnipotent.
Breeze smiled. Though, if you think about it, hostile, dethroned pseudo-deities probably make disagreeable neighbors. You'll have to figure out something to do with him. Eden didn't appear to like that idea much, but he didn't continue the argument. Kelsier turned. That should be it, then. Ham said.
What about the Ministry? Shouldn't we at least find a way to keep an eye on those Inquisitors?
Kelsier smiled. We'll let my brother deal with them.
Like hell you will,
a new voice said from the back of the room. Vin jumped to her feet, spinning and glancing toward the room's shadowed doorway. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered. He had a statuesque rigidity. He wore modest clothing, a simple shirt and trousers with a loose scar jacket. His arms were folded in dissatisfaction, and he had a hard, square face that looked a bit familiar. Vin glanced back at Kelsier. The similarity was obvious.
Marsh?
Eden said, standing.
Marsh, it is you. He promised you'd be joining the job, but well, welcome back.
Marsh's face remained impassive.
I'm not certain if I'm back or not, Eden.
If you all don't mind, I'd like to speak privately with my little brother. Kelsier didn't seem intimidated by Marsh's harsh tone. He nodded to the group. We're done for the evening, folks. The others rose slowly, giving Marsh a wide berth as they left. Vin followed them, pulling the door shut and walking down the stairs to give the appearance of retiring to her room. Less than 3 minutes later, she was back at the door, listening carefully to the conversation going on inside. Rashik is a tall man. Of course, most of these terrorist men are tall. He is young to receive so much respect from the other packmen. He has charisma, and the women of court would probably describe him as handsome in a rugged sort of way. Yet it amazes me that anyone would give heed to a man who speaks such hatred. He has never seen Kalenium, yet he curses the city. He does not know me, yet I can already see the anger and hostility in his eyes. 7. 3 years hadn't changed Marsh's appearance much. He was still the stern, commanding person Kelsier had known since childhood. There was still that glint of disappointment in his eyes, and he spoke with the same air of disapproval. Yet if Doxson were to be believed, Marsh's attitudes had changed much since that day 3 years before. Kelsier still found it hard to believe that his brother had given up leadership of the Ska Rebellion. He had always been so passionate about his work. Apparently, that passion had dimmed. Marsh walked forward, regarding the charcoal writing board with a critical eye. His clothing was stained slightly by dark ash, though his face was relatively clean for a Ska. He stood for a moment, looking over Kelsier's notes. Finally, Marsh turned and tossed a sheet of paper onto the chair beside Kelsier. "What is this?" Kelsier asked, picking it up.
The names of the 11 men you slaughtered last night, Marsh said. I thought you might at least want to know.
Kelsier tossed the paper into the crackling hearth. They served the Final Empire.
They were men, Kelsier,
Marsh snapped.
They had lives, families.
Several of them were Ska. Traitors.
People,
Marsh said.
People who were just trying to do the best with what life gave them.
Well, I'm just doing the same thing, Kelsier said. Unfortunately, life gave me the ability to push men like them off the tops of buildings. If they want to stand against me like noblemen, then they can die like noblemen. Marsh's expression darkened.
How can you be so flippant about something like this?
Because, Marsh, Kelsier said, humor is the only thing I've got left. humor and determination. Marsh snorted quietly. You should be happy, Kelsier said. After decades of listening to your lectures, I finally decided to do something worthwhile with my talents. Now that you're here to help, I'm sure... I'm not here to help, Marsh interrupted. Then why did you come? To ask you a question. Marsh stepped forward, stopping right in front of Kelsier. They were about the same height, but Marsh's stern personality always made him seem to loom taller. How dare you do this? Marsh asked quietly. I dedicated my life to overthrowing the final empire. While you and your thieving friends partied, I hid runaways. While you planned petty burglaries, I organized raids. While you lived in luxury, I watched people die of starvation. Marsh reached up, stabbing a finger at Kelsier's chest. How dare you? How dare you try and hijack the rebellion for one of your little jobs? How dare you use this dream as a way of enriching yourself? Kelsier pushed Marsh's finger away. That's not what this is about. Oh? Marsh asked, tapping the word atium on the board. Why the games, Kelsier? Why lead Yeden along, pretending to accept him as your employer? Why act like you care about the Ska? We both know what you're really after. Kelsier clenched his jaw, a bit of his humor melting away. He could always do that to me. You don't know me anymore, Marsh, Kelsier said quietly. This isn't about money. I once had more wealth than any man could spend. This job is about something different. Marsh stood close, studying Kelsier's eyes as if searching for truth in them. You always were a good liar, he finally said. Kelsier rolled his eyes. Fine, think what you want. But don't preach to me. Overthrowing the Empire might have been your dream once, but now you've become a good little Ska, standing in your shop and fawning over noblemen when they visit. I've faced reality, Marsh said. Something you've never been good at. Even if you're serious about this plan, you'll fail. Everything the rebellion has done, the raids, the thefts, the deaths, has accomplished nothing. Our best efforts were never even a mild annoyance for the Lord Ruler. Ah, Kelsier said. But being an annoyance is something that I am very good at. In fact, I'm far more than just a mild annoyance. People tell me I can be downright frustrating. Might as well use this talent for the cause of good, eh? Marsh sighed, turning away. This isn't about a cause, Kelsier. It's about revenge. It's about you, just like everything always is. I'll believe that you aren't after the money. I'll even believe that you intend to deliver Yeden this army he's apparently paying you for. But I won't believe that you care. That's where you're wrong, Marsh, Kelsier said quietly. That's where you've always been wrong about me. Marsh frowned. Perhaps. How did this start, anyway? Did Yeden come to you, or did you go to him? Does it matter? Kelsier asked. Look, Marsh, I need someone to infiltrate the Ministry. This plan won't go anywhere if we don't discover a way to keep an eye on those Inquisitors. Marsh turned. You actually expect me to help you? Kelsier nodded. That's why you came here, no matter what you say. You once told me that you thought I could do great things if I ever applied myself to a worthy goal. Well, that's what I'm doing now, and you're going to help. It's not that easy anymore, Kel, Marsh said with a shake of his head. Some people are different now. Others are gone. Kelsier let the room grow quiet. Even the hearth's fire was starting to die out. I miss her too. I'm sure that you do. But I have to be honest with you, Kel. Despite what she did, sometimes I wish that you hadn't been the one to survive the pits. I wish the same thing every day. Marsh turned, studying Kelsier with his cold, discerning eyes. the eyes of a seeker. Whatever he saw reflected inside of Kelsier must have finally met with his approval. "I'm leaving," Marsh said. "But for some reason you actually seem sincere this time. I'll come back and listen to whatever insane plan you've concocted. Then, well, we'll see." Kelsier smiled. Beneath it all, Marsh was a good man. A better one than Kelsier had ever been. As Marsh turned toward the door, Kelsier caught a flicker of shadowed movement from beneath the doorway. He immediately burned iron, and the translucent blue lines shot out from his body, connecting him to nearby sources of metal. Marsh, of course, had none on his person, not even any coins. Traveling through scar sectors of town could be very dangerous for a man who looked even marginally prosperous. Someone else, however, hadn't yet learned not to carry metal on her person. The blue lines were thin and weak. They didn't do well penetrating wood. But they were just strong enough to let Kelsier locate the belt latch of a person out in the hallway, moving quickly away from the door on silent feet. Kelsier smiled to himself. The girl was remarkably skilled. Her time on the streets, however, had also left her with remarkable scars. Hopefully, he would be able to encourage the skills while helping heal the scars. "I'll return tomorrow," Marsh said as he reached the door. "Just don't come too early," Kelsier said with a wink. "I've got some things to do tonight." Vin waited quietly in her darkened room, listening to footsteps clump down the stairs to the ground floor. She crouched beside her door, trying to determine if both sets had continued down the steps or not. The hallway fell silent, and eventually, she breathed a quiet sigh of relief. A knock sounded on the door just inches from her head. Her start of surprise nearly knocked her to the ground. "He's good," she thought. She quickly ruffled her hair and rubbed her eyes, trying to make it appear as if she had been sleeping. She untucked her shirt and waited until the knock came again before pulling open the door. Kelsier lounged against the doorframe, backlit by the hallway's single lantern. The tall man raised an eyebrow at her disheveled state. "Yes?" Vin asked, trying to sound drowsy. "So, what do you think of Marsh?" "I don't know," Vin said. "I didn't see much of him before he kicked us out." Kelsier smiled. "You're not going to admit that I caught you, are you?" Vin almost smiled back. Reen's training came to her rescue. "The man who wants you to trust him is the one you must fear the most." Her brother's voice almost seemed to whisper in her head. It had grown stronger since she had met Kelsier, as if her instincts were on edge. Kelsier studied her for a moment, then stepped back from the doorframe. "Tuck in that shirt and follow me." Vin frowned. "Where are we going?" "To begin your training." "Now?" Vin asked, glancing at the dark shutters to her room. "Of course," Kelsier said. "It's a perfect night for a stroll." Vin straightened her clothing, joining him in the hallway. If he actually planned to begin teaching her, then she wasn't going to complain no matter what the hour. They walked down the steps to the first floor. The workroom was dark, furniture projects lying half-finished in the shadows. The kitchen, however, was bright with light. "Just a minute," Kelsier said, walking toward the kitchen. Vin paused just inside the shadows of the workroom, letting Kelsier enter the kitchen without her. She could just barely see inside. Dachshund, Breeze, and Ham sat with clubs and his apprentices around a wide table. Wine and ale were present, though in small amounts, and the men were munching on a simple evening snack of puffed barley cakes and battered vegetables. Laughter trickled out into the workroom. Not raucous laughter, such as had often sounded from Cayman's table. This was something softer, something indicative of genuine mirth, of good-natured enjoyment. Vin wasn't certain what kept her out of the room. She hesitated, as if the light and the humor were a barrier, and she instead remained in the quiet, solemn workroom. She watched from the darkness, however, and wasn't completely able to suppress her longing. Kelsier returned a moment later, carrying his pack and a small cloth bundle. Vin regarded the bundle with curiosity, and he handed it to her with a smile. A present. The cloth was slick and soft in Vin's fingers, and she quickly realized what it was. She let the gray material unroll in her fingers, revealing a Mistborn cloak. Like the garment Kelsier had worn the night before, it was tailored completely from separate, ribbon-like strips of cloth. "You look surprised," Kelsier noted. "I assumed that I'd have to earn this somehow." "What's there to earn?" Kelsier said, pulling out his own cloak. "This is who you are, Vin." She paused, then threw the cloak over her shoulders and tied it on. It felt different. Thick and heavy on her shoulders, but light and unconstraining around her arms and legs. The ribbons were sewn together at the top, allowing her to pull it tight by the mantle if she wished. She felt enveloped, protected. "How does it feel?" Kelsier asked. "Good," Vin said simply. Kelsier nodded, pulling out several glass vials. He handed 2 to her. "Drink 1, keep the other in case you need it. I'll show you how to mix new vials later." Vin nodded, downing the first vial and tucking the second into her belt. "I'm having some new clothing tailored for you," Kelsier said. "You'll want to get into the habit of wearing things that don't have any metal on them. Belts with no buckles, shoes that slip on and off, trousers without clasps. Perhaps later, if you're feeling daring, we'll get you some women's clothing." Vin flushed slightly. Kelsier laughed. "I'm just teasing you. However, you're entering a new world now. You may find there are situations where it will be to your advantage to look less like a crew thief and more like a young lady." Vin nodded, following Kelsier as he walked to the shop's front door. He pushed the portal open, revealing a wall of darkly shifting mists. He stepped out into them. Taking a deep breath, Vin followed. Kelsier shut the door behind them. The cobbled street felt muffled to Vin, the shifting mists making everything just a bit damp. She couldn't see far in either direction, and the street ends seemed to fade into nothingness, paths into eternity. Above, there was no sky, just swirling currents of gray upon gray. "All right, let's begin," Kelsier said. His voice felt loud in the quiet, empty street. There was a confidence to his tone, something that, confronted with the mists all around, Vin certainly didn't feel. "Your first lesson," Kelsier said, strolling down the street, Vin trailing along beside him, "isn't about allomancy, but attitude." He swept his hand forward. "This, Vin, this is ours. The night, the mists, they belong to us. Ska avoid the mists as if they were death. Thieves and soldiers go out at night, but they fear it nonetheless. Noblemen feign nonchalance, but the mist makes them uncomfortable." He turned, regarding her. "The mists are your friend, Vin. They hide you, they protect you, and they give you power. Ministry doctrine, something rarely shared with Ska, claims that the Mistborn are descendants of the only men who remained true to the Lord Ruler during the days before his ascension. Other legends whisper that we are something beyond even the Lord Ruler's power, something that was born on that day when the mists first came upon the land." Vin nodded slightly. It seemed odd to hear Kelsier speak so openly. Buildings filled with sleeping Ska loomed on either side of the street. And yet the dark shutters and quiet air made Vin feel as if she and Kelsier were alone. Alone in the most densely populated, overcrowded city in all of the Final Empire. Kelsier continued to walk, the spring in his step incongruent with the dark gloom. "Shouldn't we be worried about soldiers?" Vin asked quietly. Her crews always had to be careful of nighttime garrison patrols. Kelsier shook his head. "Even if we were careless enough to be spotted, no Imperial patrol would dare bother Mistborn. They'd see our cloaks and pretend not to see us. Remember, nearly all Mistborn are members of the Great Houses, and the rest are from lesser Luthadel houses. Either way, they're very important individuals. Vin frowned. So, the guards just ignore the Mistborn? Kelsier shrugged. It's bad etiquette to acknowledge that the skulking rooftop figure you see is actually a very distinguished and proper High Lord, or even High Lady. Mistborn are so rare that houses can't afford to apply gender prejudices to them. Anyway, most Mistborn live two lives. The life of the court-going aristocrat, and the life of the sneaking, spying allomancer. Mistborn identities are closely guarded house secrets. Rumors regarding who is Mistborn are always a focus of high noble gossip. Kelsier turned down another street, Vin following, still a bit nervous. She wasn't certain where he was taking her. It was easy to get lost in the night. Perhaps he didn't even have a destination and was just accustoming her to the mists. All right, Kelsier said. Let's get you used to the basic metals. Can you feel your metal reserves? Vin paused. If she focused, she could distinguish 8 sources of power within her, each one far larger even than her 2 had been on the day when Kelsier had tested her. She had been reticent to use her luck much since then. She was coming to realize that she had been using a weapon she'd never really understood. A weapon that had accidentally drawn the attention of a Steel Inquisitor. Begin burning them one at a time, Kelsier said. Burning? That's what we call it when you activate an allomantic ability, Kelsier said. You burn the metal associated with that power. You'll see what I mean. Start with the metals you don't know about yet. We'll work on soothing and raging emotions some other time. Vin nodded, pausing in the middle of the street. Tentatively, she reached out to one of the new sources of power. One of them was slightly familiar to her. Had she used it before without realizing it? What would it do? Only one way to find out. Uncertain what exactly she was supposed to do, Vin gripped the source of power and tried to use it. Immediately, she felt a flare of heat from within her chest. It wasn't discomforting, but it was obvious and distinct. Along with the warmth came something else. A feeling of rejuvenation and of power. She felt more solid somehow. What happened? Kelsier asked. I feel different, Vin said. She held up her hand, and it seemed as if the limb reacted just a bit too quickly. The muscles were eager. My body is strange. I don't feel tired anymore, and I feel alert. Ah, Kelsier said. That's pewter. It enhances your physical abilities, making you stronger, more able to resist fatigue and pain. You'll react more quickly when you're burning it, and your body will be tougher. Vin flexed experimentally. Her muscles didn't seem any bigger, yet she could feel their strength. It wasn't just in her muscles, however. It was everything about her. Her bones, her flesh, her skin. She reached out to her reserve and could feel it shrinking. I'm running out, she said. Kelsier nodded. Pewter burns relatively quickly. The vial I gave you was measured to contain about 10 minutes worth of continuous burning, though it will go faster if you flare often and slower if you are careful about when you use it. Flare? You can burn your metals a little more powerfully if you try, Kelsier said. It makes them run out much faster, and it's difficult to maintain. But it can give you an extra boost. Vin frowned, trying to do as he said. With a push of effort, she was able to stoke the flames within her chest, flaring the pewter. It was like the inhaled breath before a daring leap, a sudden rush of strength and power. Her body grew tense with anticipation, and for just a moment she felt invincible. Then it passed, her body relaxing slowly. Interesting, she thought, noting how quickly her pewter had burned during that brief moment. Now there's something you need to know about allomantic metals, Kelsier said as they strolled forward in the mists. The more pure they are, the more effective they are. The vials we prepare contain absolutely pure metals, prepared and sold specifically for allomancers. Alloys, like pewter, are even trickier, since the metal percentages have to be mixed just right if you want maximum power. In fact, if you aren't careful when you buy your metals, you could end up with the wrong alloy entirely. Vin frowned. You mean someone might scam me? Not intentionally, Kelsier said. The thing is, most of the terms that people use, words like brass, pewter, and bronze, are really quite vague when you get down to it. Pewter, for instance, is generally accepted as an alloy of tin mixed with lead, with perhaps some copper or silver depending on the use and the circumstances. Allomancer's pewter, however, is an alloy of 91% tin, 9% lead. If you want maximum strength from your metal, you have to use those percentages. And if you burn the wrong percentage? Vin asked. If the mixture is only off by a bit, you'll still get some power out of it, Kelsier said. However, if it's too far off, burning it will make you sick. Vin nodded slowly. I think I've burned this metal before. Once in a while, in very small amounts. Trace metals, Kelsier said. From drinking water contaminated by metals or by eating with pewter utensils. Vin nodded. Some of the mugs in Cayman's lair had been pewter. All right, Kelsier said. Extinguish the pewter and let's move on to another metal. Vin did as asked. The withdrawal of power left her feeling weak, tired, and exposed. Now, Kelsier said, you should be able to notice a kind of pairing between your reserves of metal. Like the two emotion metals, Vin said. Exactly. Find the metal linked to pewter. I see it, Vin said. There are two metals for every power, Kelsier said. One pushes, one pulls. The second is usually an alloy of the first. For emotions, the external mental powers, you pull with zinc and push with brass. You just used pewter to push your body. That's one of the internal physical powers. Like Ham, Vin said. He burns pewter. Kelsier nodded. Mistings who can burn pewter are called thugs. A crude term, I suppose, but they tend to be rather crude people. Our dear Hammond is something of an exception to that rule. So what does the other internal physical metal do? Try it and see. Vin did so eagerly, and the world suddenly became brighter around her. Or, well, that wasn't quite right. She could see better, and she could see farther, but the mists were still there. They were just more translucent. The ambient light around her seemed brighter somehow. There were other changes. She could feel her clothing. She realized that she had always been able to feel it, but she usually ignored it. Now, however, it felt closer. She could sense the textures, and was acutely aware of the places where the cloth was tight on her. She was hungry. That too she had been ignoring. Yet now her hunger seemed far more pressing. Her skin felt wetter, and she could smell the crisp air mixed with scents of dirt, soot, and refuse. Tin enhances your senses, Kelsier said, his voice suddenly seeming quite loud. And it's one of the slowest burning metals. The tin in that vial is enough to keep you going for hours. Most Mistborn leave their tin on whenever they're out in the mists. I've had mine on since we left the shop. Vin nodded. The wealth of sensations was nearly overwhelming. She could hear creaks and scuffles in the darkness, and they made her want to jump in alarm, certain that someone was sneaking up behind her. This is going to take some getting used to. Leave it burning, Kelsier said, waving for her to walk beside him as he continued down the street. You'll want to accustom yourself to the enhanced senses. Just don't flare it all the time. Not only would you run out of it very quickly, but perpetually flaring metals does strange things to people. Strange? Vin asked. Metals, especially tin and pewter, stretch your body. Flaring the metals only pushes this stretching further. Stretch it too far for too long and things start to break. Vin nodded uncomfortably. Kelsier fell quiet, and they continued to walk, letting Vin explore her new sensations and the detailed world that tin revealed. Before, her vision had been restricted to a tiny pocket within the night. Now, however, she saw an entire city enveloped by a blanket of shifting, swirling mist. She could make out keeps like small, dark mountains in the distance, and could see specks of light from windows like pin-pricked holes in the night. And above, she saw lights in the sky. She stopped, gazing up in wonder. They were faint, blurred to even her tin-enhanced eyes, but she could just barely make them out. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, so small, like the dying embers of candles recently extinguished. Stars, Kelsier said, strolling up beside her. You can't see them very often, even with tin. It must be a particularly clear night. People used to be able to look up and see them every night. That was before the mists came, before the ash mounts erupted ash and smoke into the sky. Vin glanced at him. How do you know? Kelsier smiled. The Lord Ruler has tried very hard to crush memories of those days, but still some remain. He turned, not really having answered her question, and continued to walk. Vin joined him. Suddenly, with Tin, the mists around her didn't seem so ominous. She was beginning to see how Kelsier could walk about at night with such confidence. All right, Kelsier eventually said. Let's try another metal. Vin nodded, leaving her tin on but picking another metal to burn as well. When she did, a very strange thing happened. A multitude of faint blue lines sprung from her chest, streaking out into the spinning mists. She froze, gasping slightly and looking down at her chest. Most of the lines were thin, like translucent pieces of twine, though a couple were as thick as yarn. Kelsier chuckled. Leave that metal and its partner alone for the moment. They're a bit more complicated than the others. What? Vin asked, tracing the lines of blue light with her eyes. They pointed at random objects. Doors, windows, a couple even pointed at Kelsier. We'll get to it, he promised. Extinguish that one and try one of the last two. Vin extinguished the strange metal and ignored its companion, picking one of the last metals. Immediately, she felt a strange vibration. Vin paused. The pulses didn't make a sound that she could hear, yet she could feel them washing across her. They seemed to be coming from Kelsier. She looked at him, frowning. That's probably bronze, Kelsier said. The internal mental pulling metal. It lets you sense when someone is using allomancy nearby. Seekers, like my brother, use it. Generally, it's not that useful, unless you happen to be a Steel Inquisitor searching for Ska Mystics. Vin paled. Inquisitors can use allomancy? Kelsier nodded. They're all Seekers. I'm not sure if that's because Seekers are chosen to become Inquisitors, or if the process of becoming an Inquisitor grants the power. Either way, since their main duties are to find half-breed children and noblemen who use allomancy improperly, it's a useful skill for them to have. Unfortunately, useful for them means rather annoying for us. Vin began to nod, then froze. The pulsing had stopped. What happened? She asked. I started burning copper, Kelsier said. The companion to bronze. When you burn copper, it hides your use of powers from other allomancers. You can try burning it now if you want, though you won't sense much. Vin did so. The only change was a feeling of slight vibration within her. Copper is a vital metal to learn, Kelsier said. It will hide you from Inquisitors. We probably didn't have anything to worry about tonight. The Inquisitors would assume us to be regular noble Mistborn, out for training. However, if you're ever in a Ska guise and need to burn metals, make sure you turn on your copper first. Vin nodded appreciatively. In fact, Kelsier said, many Mistborn keep their copper on all the time. It burns slowly, and it makes you invisible to other Allomancers. It hides you from bronze. And it also prevents others from manipulating your emotions. Vin perked up. I thought that might interest you, Kelsier said. Anyone burning copper is immune to emotional allomancy. In addition, copper's influence occurs in a bubble around you. This cloud, called a copper cloud, hides anyone inside of it from the senses of a seeker, though it won't make them immune to emotional allomancy like it will you.
Clubs, Vin said. That's what a smoker does.
Kelsier nodded. If one of our people is noticed by a seeker, they can run back to the lair and disappear. They can also practice their abilities without fear of being discovered. Allomantic pulses coming from a shop in a scar sector of town would be a quick giveaway to a passing Inquisitor.
But you can burn copper, Vin said. Why were you so worried about finding a smoker for the crew?
I can burn copper, true, Kelsier said. And so can you. We can use all of the powers, but we can't be everywhere. A successful crew leader needs to know how to divide labor, especially on a job as big as this one. Standard practice is a copper cloud going at all times in the lair. Clubs doesn't do it all himself. Several of his apprentices are smokers too. When you hire a man like Clubs, it's understood that he'll provide you with a base of operations and a team of smokers competent enough to keep you hidden at all times. Vin nodded. However, she was more interested in copper's ability to protect her emotions. She would need to locate enough of it to keep it burning all the time. They started walking again, and Kelsier gave her more time to get used to burning tin. Vin's mind, however, began to wander. Something didn't feel right to her. Why was Kelsier telling her all of these things? It seemed like he was giving away his secrets too easily. Except one, she thought suspiciously. The medal with the blue lines. He hasn't gone back to it yet. Perhaps that was the thing he was going to keep from her, the power he would hold in reserve to maintain control over her. It must be strong, the most powerful of the 8. As they walked through the quiet streets, Vin reached tentatively inside. She eyed Kelsier, then carefully burned that unknown metal. Again, the lines sprang up around her, pointing in seemingly random directions. The lines moved with her. One end of each thread stayed stuck to her chest, while the other end remained attached to a given place along the street. New lines appeared as she walked, and old ones faded, disappearing behind. The lines came in various widths, and some of them were brighter than others. Curious, Vin tested the lines with her mind, trying to discover their secret. She was focused on a particularly small and innocent-looking one, and found that she could feel it individually if she concentrated. She almost felt like she could touch it. She reached out her hand and gave it a slight tug. The line shook, and something immediately flew out of the darkness toward her. Vin yelped, trying to jump away, but the object, a rusty nail, shot directly toward her. Suddenly, something grabbed the nail, ripping it away and throwing it back out into the darkness. Vin came up from her roll in a tense crouch, mist cloak fluttering around her. She scanned the darkness, then glanced at Kelsier, who was chuckling softly. "I should have known you'd try that," he said. Vin flushed in embarrassment. "Come on," he said, waving her over. "No harm done." "The nail attacked me." Did that metal bring objects to life? That would be an incredible power indeed. "Actually, you kind of attacked yourself," Kelsier said. Vin stood carefully, then joined him as he began to walk down the street again. "I'll explain what you did in a moment," he promised. "First, there's something you have to understand about allomancy." "Another rule?" "More a philosophy," Kelsier said. "It has to do with consequences." Vin frowned. "What do you mean?" "Every action we take has consequences, Vin," Kelsier said. "I found that in both allomancy and life. The person who can best judge the consequences of their actions will be the most successful. Take burning pewter, for instance. What are its consequences? It shrunk. You get stronger. What happens if you're carrying something heavy when your pewter runs out? Vin paused. I suppose you'd drop it. And if it's too heavy, you could hurt yourself seriously. Many a misting thug has shrugged off a dire wound while fighting, only to die from that same wound once their pewter ran out. I see, Vin said quietly. Ha! Vin jumped in shock, throwing her hands up over her enhanced ears. Ow! She complained, glaring at Kelsier. He smiled. Burning tin has consequences too. If someone produces a sudden light or sound, you can be blinded or stunned. But what does that have to do with those last two metals? Iron and steel give you the ability to manipulate other metals around you, Kelsier explained. With iron, you can pull a metal source toward yourself. With steel, you can push one away. Ah, here we are. Kelsier stopped, looking up ahead. Through the mist, Vin could see the massive city wall looming above them. What are we doing here? We're going to practice iron pulling and steel pushing, Kelsier said. But first, some basics. He pulled something out of his belt, a clip, the smallest denomination of coin. He held it up before her, standing to the side. Burn steel, the opposite of the metal you burned a few moments ago. Vin nodded. Again, the blue lines sprang up around her. One of them pointed directly at the coin in Kelsier's hand. All right, Kelsier said. Push on it. Vin reached toward the proper thread and pushed slightly. The coin flipped out of Kelsier's fingers, traveling directly away from Vin. She continued to focus on it, pushing the coin through the air until it snapped against the wall of a nearby house. Vin was thrown violently backward in a sudden jerking motion. Kelsier caught her and kept her from falling to the ground. Vin stumbled and righted herself. Across the street, the coin, now released from her control, plinked to the ground. What happened? Kelsier asked her. She shook her head. I don't know. I pushed on the coin and it flew away. But when it hit the wall, I was pushed away. Why? Vin frowned thoughtfully. I guess the coin couldn't go anywhere, so I had to be the one that moved. Kelsier nodded approvingly. Consequences, Vin. You use your own weight when you steel push. If you're a lot heavier than your anchor, it will fly away from you like that coin did. However, if the object is heavier than you are, or if it runs into something that is, you'll be pushed away. Iron pulling is similar. Either you'll be pulled toward the object, or it will be pulled toward you. If your weights are similar, then you'll both move. This is the great art of allomancy, Vin. Knowing how much or how little you will move when you burn steel or iron will give you a major advantage over your opponents. You'll find that these two are the most versatile and useful of your abilities. Vin nodded. Now remember, he continued, in both cases, the force of your push or pull is directly away from or toward you. You can't flip things around with your mind, controlling them to go wherever you want. That's not the way that allomancy works, because that's not the way the physical world works. When you push against something, whether with allomancy or with your hands, it goes directly in the opposite direction. Force, reactions, consequences. Understand? Vin nodded again. Good, Kelsier said happily. Now, let's go jump over that wall. What? He left her standing dumbfounded in the street. She watched him approach the base of the wall, then scurried over to him. You're insane, she said quietly. Kelsier smiled. I think that's the second time today you've said that to me. You need to pay better attention. If you'd been listening to everyone else, you'd know that my sanity departed long ago. Kelsier, she said, looking up at the wall. I can't. I mean, I've never really even used allomancy before this evening. Yes, but you're such a quick learner, Kelsier said, pulling something out from beneath his cloak. It appeared to be a belt. Here, put this on. It's got metal weights strapped to it. If something goes wrong, I'll probably be able to catch you.
Probably?
Vin asked nervously, strapping on the belt. Kelsier smiled, then dropped a large metal ingot at his feet. Put the ingot directly below you, and remember to steel push, not iron pull. Don't stop pushing until you reach the top of the wall. Then he bent down and jumped. Kelsier shot into the air, his dark form vanishing into the curling mists. Vin waited for a moment, but he didn't plummet back down to his doom. All was still, even to her enhanced ears. The mists whirled playfully around her, taunting her, daring her. She glanced down at the ingot, burning steel. The blue line glowed with a faint, ghostly light. She stepped over to the ingot, standing with one foot on either side of it. She glanced up at the mists, then down one last time. Finally, she took a deep breath and pushed against the ingot with all of her strength. He shall defend their ways, yet shall violate them. He will be their savior, yet they shall call him heretic. His name shall be Discord, yet they shall love him for it. 8. Vin shot into the air. She suppressed a scream, remembering to continue pushing despite her fear. The stone wall was a blur of motion just a few feet away from her. The ground disappeared below, and the line of blue pointing toward the ingot grew fainter and fainter. What happens if it disappears? She began to slow. The fainter the line grew, the more her speed decreased. After just a few moments of flight, she crept to a halt, and was left hanging in the air above a nearly invisible blue line. I've always liked the view from up here. Vin glanced to the side. Kelsier stood a short distance away. She had been so focused that she hadn't noticed that she was hovering just a few feet from the top of the wall. "Help," she said, continuing to push desperately lest she fall. The mists below her shifted and spun, like some dark ocean of damned souls. "You don't have to worry too much," Kelsier said. "It's easier to balance in the air if you have a tripod of anchors, but you can do fine with a single anchor. Your body is used to balancing itself. Part of what you've been doing since you learned to walk transfers to allomancy. As long as you stay still, hanging at the very edge of your pushing ability, you'll be pretty stable. Your mind and body will correct any slight deviations from the base center of your anchor below, keeping you from falling to the sides. If you were to push on something else, or move too much to one side, though, well, you'd lose your anchor below, and wouldn't be pushing directly up anymore. Then you'd have problems. You'd tip over like a lead weight on top of a very tall pole." "Kelsier," Vin said. "I hope you aren't afraid of heights, Vin," Kelsier said. "That's quite a disadvantage for a Mistborn." "I'm not afraid of heights," Vin said through gritted teeth. "But I'm also not accustomed to hanging in the air 100 feet above the bloody street." Kelsier chuckled, but Vin felt a force tug against her belt, pulling her through the air toward him. He grabbed her and pulled her up over the stone railing, then set her down beside him. He reached an arm over the side of the wall. A second later, the ingot shot up through the air, scraping along the side of the wall until it flipped into his waiting hand. "Good job," he said. "Now we go back down." He tossed the ingot over his shoulder, casting it into the dark mists on the other side of the wall. "We're really going outside?" Vin asked. "Outside the city walls? At night?" Kelsier smiled in that infuriating way of his. He walked over and climbed onto the battlements. Varying the strength with which you push or pull is difficult, but possible. It's better to just fall a bit, then push to slow yourself. Let go and fall some more, then push again. If you get the rhythm right, you'll reach the ground just fine. "Kelsier," Vin said, approaching the wall, "I don't..." "You're at the top of the city wall now, Vin," he said, stepping out into the air. He hung, hovering, balanced as he'd explained to her before. "There are only two ways down. Either you jump off, or you try and explain to that guard patrol why a Mistborn needs to use their stairwell. Vin turned with concern, noting an approaching bob of lantern light in the dark mists. She turned back to Kelsier, but he was gone. She cursed, bending over the side of the wall and looking down into the mists. She could hear the guards behind her, speaking softly to one another as they walked along the wall. Kelsier was right. She didn't have many options. Angry, she climbed up onto the battlement. She wasn't afraid of heights in particular, but who wouldn't be apprehensive standing atop the wall looking down at her doom? Vin's heart fluttered, her stomach twisting. I hope Kelsier's out of the way, she thought, checking the blue line to make certain she was above the ingot. Then she stepped off. She immediately began to plummet toward the ground. She pushed reflexively with her steel, but her trajectory was off. She had fallen to the side of the ingot, not directly toward it. Consequently, her push nudged her to the side even farther, and she began to tumble through the air. Alarmed, she pushed again, harder this time, flaring her steel. The sudden effort launched her back upward. She arced sideways through the air, popping up into the air alongside the wall top. The passing guards spun with surprise, but their faces soon became indistinct as Vin fell back down toward the ground. Mind muddled by terror, she reflexively reached out and pulled against the ingot, trying to yank herself toward it. And of course, it obediently shot up toward her. I'm dead. Then her body lurched, pulled upward by the belt. Her descent slowed until she was drifting quietly through the air. Kelsier appeared in the mists, standing on the ground beneath her. He was, of course, smiling. He let her drop the last few feet, catching her, then setting her upright on the soft earth. She stood quivering for a moment, breathing in terse, anxious breaths. Well, that was fun, Kelsier said lightly. Vin didn't respond. Kelsier sat down on a nearby rock, obviously giving her time to gather her wits. Eventually, she burned pewter, using the sensation of solidness it provided to steady her nerves. You did well, Kelsier said. I nearly died. Everybody does their first time, Kelsier said. Iron pulling and steel pushing are dangerous skills. You can impale yourself with a bit of metal that you pull into your own body. You can jump and leave your anchor too far behind, or you can make a dozen other mistakes. My experience, limited though it is, has been that it's better to get into those extreme circumstances early, when someone can watch over you. Anyway, I assume you can understand why it's important for an Allomancer to carry as little metal on their body as possible. Vin nodded, then paused, reaching up to her ear. My earring, she said. I'll have to stop wearing it. Does it have a clip on the back? Kelsier asked. Vin shook her head. It's just a small stud, and the pin on the back bends down. Then you'll be all right, Kelsier said. Metal in your body, even if only a bit of it is in your body, can't be pushed or pulled. Otherwise, another Allomancer could rip the metals out of your stomach while you were burning them. Good to know, Vin thought. It's also why those Inquisitors can walk around so confidently with a pair of steel spikes sticking out of their heads. The metal pierces their bodies, so it can't be affected by another Allomancer. Keep the earring. It's small, so you won't be able to do much with it, but you could use it as a weapon in an emergency. All right. Now, you ready to go? She looked up at the wall, preparing to jump again, then nodded. We're not going back up, Kelsier said. Come on. Vin frowned as Kelsier began to walk out into the mists. So he does have a destination after all. Or has he just decided to wander some more? Oddly, his affable nonchalance made him very difficult to read. Vin hurried to keep up, not wanting to be left alone in the mists. The landscape around Luthadel was barren, save for scrub and weeds. Prickles and dried leaves, both dusted with ash from an earlier ashfall, rubbed against her legs as they walked. The underbrush crunched as they walked, quiet, and a bit sodden with mist dew. Occasionally, they passed heaps of ash that had been carted out of the city. Most of the time, however, ash was thrown into the river Channel, which passed through the city. Water broke it down eventually, or at least that was what Vin assumed. Otherwise, the entire continent would have been buried long ago. Vin stayed close to Kelsier as they walked. Though she had traveled outside cities before, she had always moved as part of a group of boatmen, the Ska workers who ran narrowboats and barges up and down the many canal routes in the Final Empire. It had been hard work. Most noblemen used Ska instead of horses to pull the boats along the towpath, but there had been a certain freedom to knowing that she was traveling at all. For most Ska, even Ska thieves, never left their plantation or town. The constant movement from city to city had been Reen's choice. He had been obsessive about never getting locked down. He usually got them places on canal boats run by underground crews, never staying in one place for more than a year. He had kept moving, always going, as if running from something. They continued to walk. At night, even the barren hills and scrub-covered plains took on a forbidding air. Vin didn't speak, though she tried to make as little noise as possible. She had heard tales of what went abroad in the land at night, and the cover of the mists, even pierced by tin as it now was, made her feel as if she were being watched. The sensation grew more unnerving as they traveled. Soon she began to hear noises in the darkness. They were muffled and faint, crackles of weeds, shuffles in the echoing mist. "You're just being paranoid," she told herself as she jumped at some half-imagined sound. Eventually, however, she could stand it no more. "Kelsier," she said with an urgent whisper, one that sounded betrayingly loud to her enhanced ears. "I think there's something out there." "Hmm?" Kelsier asked. He looked lost in his thoughts. "I think something is following us." "Oh," Kelsier said. "Yes, you're right. It's a mist wraith." Vin stopped dead in her tracks. Kelsier, however, kept going. "Kelsier," she said, causing him to pause. "You mean they're real?" "Of course they are," Kelsier said. "Where do you think all the stories came from?" Vin stood in dumbfounded shock. "You want to go look at it?" Kelsier asked. "Look at the mist wraith?" Vin asked. "Are you—" She stopped. Kelsier chuckled, strolling back to her. "Mist wraiths might be a bit disturbing to look at, but they're relatively harmless. They're scavengers, mostly. Come on." He began to retrace their footsteps, waving her to follow. Reluctant, but morbidly curious, Vin followed. Kelsier walked at a brisk pace, leading her to the top of a relatively scrub-free hill. He crouched down, motioning for Vin to do likewise. "Their hearing isn't very good," he said as she knelt in the rough ashen dirt beside him. "But their sense of smell, or rather taste, is quite acute. It's probably following our trail, hoping that we'll discard something edible." Vin squinted in the darkness. "I can't see it," she said, searching the mists for a shadowed figure. "There," Kelsier said, pointing toward a squat hill. Vin frowned, imagining a creature crouching atop the hill, watching her as she looked for it. Then the hill moved. Vin jumped slightly. The dark mound, perhaps 10 feet tall and twice as long, lurched forward in a strange, shuffling gait, and Vin leaned forward, trying to get a better look. "Flare your tin," Kelsier suggested. Vin nodded, calling upon a burst of extra allomantic power. Everything immediately became lighter, the mists becoming even less of an obstruction. What she saw caused her to shiver, fascinated, revolted, and more than a little disturbed. The creature had smoky, translucent skin, and Vin could see its bones. It had dozens upon dozens of limbs, and each one looked as if it had come from a different animal. There were human hands, bovine hooves, canine haunches, and others she couldn't identify. The mismatched limbs let the creature walk, though it was more of a shadow. It crawled along slowly, moving like an awkward centipede. Many of the limbs, in fact, didn't even look functional. They jutted from the creature's flesh in a twisted, unnatural fashion. Its body was bulbous and elongated. It wasn't just a blob, though. There was a strange logic to its form. It had a distinct skeletal structure, and, squinting through tin-enhanced eyes, she thought she could make out translucent muscles and sinew wrapping the bones. The creature flexed odd jumbles of muscles as it moved, and appeared to have a dozen different rib cages. Along the main body, arms and legs hung at unnerving angles. And heads. She counted 6. Despite the translucent skin, she could make out a horse head sitting beside that of a deer. Another head turned toward her, and she could see its human skull. The head sat atop a long spinal cord attached to some kind of animal torso, which in turn attached to a jumble of strange bones. Vin nearly retched. What? How? Mist wraiths have malleable bodies, Kelsier said. They can shape their skin around any skeletal structure, and can even recreate muscles and organs if they have a model to mimic. You mean? Kelsier nodded. When they find a corpse, they envelop it and slowly digest the muscles and organs. Then they use what they've eaten as a pattern, creating an exact duplicate of the dead creature. They rearrange the parts a little bit, excreting the bones they don't want, while adding the ones they do want to their body, forming a jumble like what you see out there. Vin watched the creature shamble across the field, following her tracks. A flap of slimy skin drooped from its underbelly, trailing along the ground. Tasting for scents, Vin thought, following the smell of our passing. She let her tin return to normal, and the mist wraith once again became a shadowed mound. The silhouette, however, only seemed to heighten its abnormality. Are they intelligent, then? Vin asked. If they can split up a body and put the pieces where they want? Intelligent? Kelsier asked. No, not one this young. More instinctual than intelligent. Vin shivered again. Do people know about these things? I mean, other than the legends. What do you mean by people? Kelsier asked. A lot of Allomancers know about them, and I'm sure the Ministry does. Regular people? Well, they just don't go out at night. Most Ska fear and curse mist wraiths, but go their entire lives without actually seeing one. Lucky for them, Vin muttered. Why doesn't someone do something about these things? Kelsier shrugged. They're not that dangerous. That one has a human head. It probably found a corpse, Kelsier said. I've never heard of a mist wraith attacking a full-grown, healthy adult. That's probably why everyone leaves them alone. And of course the high nobility have devised their own uses for the creatures. Vin looked at him questioningly, but he said no more, rising and walking down the hillside. She shot one more glance at the unnatural creature, then took off, following Kelsier. Is that what you brought me out here to see? Vin asked. Kelsier chuckled. Mist wraiths might look eerie, but they're hardly worth such a long trip. No, we're heading over there. She followed his gesture and was able to make out a change in the landscape ahead. The Imperial High Road? We've circled around to the front of the city. Kelsier nodded. After a short walk, during which Vin glanced backward no less than 3 times to make certain the mist wraith hadn't gained on them, they left the scrub and stepped onto the flat, packed earth of the Imperial High Road. Kelsier paused, scanning the road in either direction. Vin frowned, wondering what he was doing. Then she saw the carriage. It was parked by the side of the high road, and Vin could see that there was a man waiting beside it. "Oh, Sazed," Kelsier said, walking forward. The man bowed. "Master Kelsier," he said, his smooth voice carrying well in the night air. It had a higher pitch to it, and he spoke with an almost melodic accent. "I almost thought that you had decided not to come." "You know me, Saze," Kelsier said, jovially slapping the man on the shoulder. "I'm the soul of punctuality." He turned and waved a hand toward Vin. This apprehensive little creature is Vin.
Ah, yes,
Sazed said, speaking in a slow, well-enunciated way. There was something strange about his accent. Vin approached cautiously, studying the man. Sazed had a long, flat face and a willowy body. He was even taller than Kelsier, tall enough to be a bit abnormal, and his arms were unusually long.
You're a terraceman,
Vin said. His earlobes had been stretched out, and the ears themselves contained studs that ran around their perimeter. He wore the lavish, colorful robes of a terraced steward. The garments were made of embroidered, overlapping V-shapes, alternating among the three colors of his master's house.
Yes, child,
Sazed said, bowing.
Have you known many of my people?
None, Vin said, but I know that the high nobility prefer terracemen, stewards, and attendants.
Indeed they do, child,
Sazed said. He turned to Kelsier.
We should go, Master Kelsier. It is late, and we are still an hour away from Felice.
Felice, Vin thought.
So we're going to see the imposter, Lord Renew.
Sazed opened the carriage door for them, then closed it after they climbed in. Vin settled on one of the plush seats as she heard Sazed climb atop the vehicle and set the horses in motion. Kelsier sat quietly in the carriage. The window shades were closed against the mist, and a small lantern, half shielded, hung in the corner. Vin rode on the seat directly across from him, her legs tucked up underneath her, her enveloping mist cloak pulled close, hiding her arms and legs. She always does that, Kelsier thought. Wherever she is, she tries to be as small and unnoticeable as possible. So tense. Vin didn't sit, she crouched. She didn't walk, she prowled. Even when she was sitting in the open, she seemed to be trying to hide. She's a brave one, though. During his own training, Kelsier hadn't been quite so willing to throw himself off of a city wall. Old Gemmel had been forced to push him. Vin watched him with those quiet, dark eyes of hers. When she noticed his attention, she glanced away, huddling down a little more within her cloak. Unexpectedly, however, she spoke. "Your brother," she said, in her soft, near whisper of a voice. "You two don't get along very well." Kelsier raised an eyebrow. "No, we never have, really. It's a shame. We should, but we just don't." "He's older than you?" Kelsier nodded. "Did he beat you often?" Vin asked. Kelsier frowned. "Beat me? No, he didn't beat me at all." "You stopped him then?" Vin said. "Maybe that's why he doesn't like you. How did you escape? Did you run, or were you just stronger than him?" "Vin, Marsh never tried to beat me. We argued, true, but we never really wanted to hurt one another." Vin didn't contradict him, but he could see in her eyes that she didn't believe him. What a life, Kelsier thought, but there were so many children like Vin in the underground. Of course, most died before reaching her age. Kelsier had been one of the lucky ones. His mother had been a resourceful mistress of a high nobleman, a clever woman who had managed to hide the fact that she was Ska from her lord. Kelsier and Marsh had grown up privileged, considered illegitimate but still noble, until their father had finally discovered the truth. "Why did you teach me those things?" Vin asked, interrupting his thoughts. "About allomancy, I mean." Kelsier frowned. "I promised you that I would." "Now that I know your secrets, what is to keep me from running away from you?" "Nothing," Kelsier said. Once again, her distrusting glare told him that she didn't believe his answer. "There are medals you didn't tell me about. Back in our meeting on the first day, you said there were 10. Kelsier nodded, leaning forward. "There are, but I didn't leave the last two out because I wanted to keep things from you. They're just difficult to get used to. It will be easier if you practice with the basic medals first." However, if you want to know about the last two, I can teach you once we arrive in Feliz. Finn's eyes narrowed. Kelsier rolled his eyes. I'm not trying to trick you. People serve on my crews because they want to, and I'm effective because they can rely on one another. No distrust, no betrayals. Except one, Finn whispered. The betrayal that sent you to the pits. Kelsier froze. Where did you hear that? Finn shrugged. Kelsier sighed, rubbing his forehead with one hand. That wasn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to scratch his scars, the ones that ran all along his fingers and hands, twisting up his arms toward his shoulders. He resisted. That isn't something worth talking about, he said. But there was a traitor, Finn said. We don't know for certain. That sounded weak, even to him. Regardless, my crews rely on trust. That means no coercions. If you want out, we can go back to Luthadel right now. I'll show you the last two medals, then you can be on your way. I don't have enough money to survive on my own, Finn said. Kelsier reached inside of his cloak and pulled out a bag of coins, then tossed it onto the seat beside her. 3,000 boxings, the money I took from Cayman. Finn glanced at the bag distrustfully. Take it, Kelsier said. You're the one who earned it. From what I've been able to gather, your allomancy was behind most of Cayman's recent successes, and you were the one who risked pushing the emotions of an obligator. Finn didn't move. Fine, Kelsier thought, reaching up and knocking on the underside of the coachman's chair. The carriage stopped, and Sazed soon appeared at his window. Turn the carriage around, please, Saz, Kelsier said. Take us back to Luthadel. Yes, Master Kelsier. Within moments, the carriage was rolling back in the direction it had come. Finn watched in silence, but she seemed a little less certain of herself. She eyed the bag of coins. I'm serious, Finn, Kelsier said. I can't have someone on my team who doesn't want to work with me. Turning you away isn't a punishment. It's just the way things must be. Finn didn't respond. Letting her go would be a gamble, but forcing her to stay would be a bigger one. Kelsier sat, trying to read her, trying to understand her. Would she betray him to the final empire if she left? He thought not. She wasn't a bad person. She just thought that everybody else was. I think your plan is crazy, she said quietly. So do half the people on the crew. You can't defeat the final empire. We don't have to, Kelsier said. We just have to get Eden an army, then seize the palace. The Lord Ruler will stop you, Finn said. You can't beat him. He's immortal. We have the 11th medal, Kelsier said. We'll find a way to kill him. The Ministry is too powerful. They'll find your army and destroy it. Kelsier leaned forward, looking Finn in the eye. You trusted me enough to jump off the top of a wall, and I caught you. You're going to have to trust me this time, too. She obviously didn't like the word trust very much. She studied him in the weak lantern light, remaining quiet long enough that the silence grew uncomfortable. Finally, she snatched the bag of coins, quickly hiding it beneath her cloak. I'll stay, she said. But not because I trust you. Kelsier raised an eyebrow. Why then? Finn shrugged, and she sounded perfectly honest when she spoke. Because I want to see what happens. Having a keep in Luthadel qualified a house for high noble status. However, having a keep didn't mean that one had to live in it, especially not all of the time. Many families also maintained a residence in one of Luthadel's outskirt cities. Less crowded, cleaner, and less strict in its observance of imperial laws, Feliz was a rich town. Rather than containing imposing buttressed keeps, it was filled with lavish manors and villas. Trees even lined some of the streets. Most of them were aspens, whose bone-white bark was somehow resistant to the discoloring of the ash. Vin watched the mist-cloaked city through her window, the carriage lantern extinguished at her request. Burning tin, she was able to study the neatly organized and well-groomed streets. This was a section of Felice she had rarely seen. Despite the town's opulence, its slums were remarkably similar to the ones in every other city. Kelsier watched the city through his own window, frowning.
"You disapprove of the waste,"
Vin guessed, her voice a whisper. The sound would carry to Kelsier's enhanced ears.
"You see the riches of this city and think of the Ska who worked to create it."
"That's part of it," Kelsier said, his own voice barely a whisper. "There's more, though. Considering the amount of money spent on it, this city should be beautiful." Vin cocked her head.
"It is."
Kelsier shook his head. "The homes are still stained black. The soil is still arid and lifeless. The trees still grow leaves of brown."
"Of course they're brown. What else would they be?"
"Green," Kelsier said. "Everything should be green."
Green? Vin thought. What a strange thought.
She tried to imagine trees with green leaves, but the image seemed silly. Kelsier certainly had his quirks, though anyone who had spent so long at the pits of Hathsin was bound to be left a bit strange. He turned back toward her. "Before I forget, there are a couple more things you should know about Alamancy." Vin nodded. "First," Kelsier said, "remember to burn away any unused metals you have inside of you at the end of the night. Some of the metals we use can be poisonous if digested. It's best not to sleep with them in your stomach."
"All right,"
Vin said. "Also," Kelsier said, "never try to burn a metal that isn't one of the 10. I warned you that impure metals and alloys can make you sick. Well, if you try to burn a metal that isn't allomantically sound at all, it could be deadly." Vin nodded solemnly.
"Good to know,"
she thought. "Ah," Kelsier said, turning back toward the window. "Here we are. The newly purchased Mana Renu. You should probably take off your cloak. The people here are loyal to us, but it always pays to be careful." Vin agreed completely. She pulled off the cloak, letting Kelsier tuck it in his pack. Then she peeked out the carriage window, peering through the mists at the approaching manor. The grounds had a low stone wall and an iron gate. A pair of guards opened the way as Sazed identified himself. The roadway inside was lined with aspens, and atop the hill ahead, Vin could see a large manor house, phantom light spilling from its windows. Sazed pulled the carriage up before the manor, then handed the reins to a servant and climbed down.
"Welcome to Mana Renu, Mistress Vin,"
he said, opening the door and gesturing to help her down. Vin eyed his hand, but didn't take it, instead scrambling down on her own. The terraceman didn't seem offended by her refusal. The steps to the manor house were lit by a double line of lantern poles. As Kelsier hopped from the carriage, Vin could see a group of men gathering at the top of the white marble stairs. Kelsier climbed the steps with a springy stride. Vin followed behind, noticing how clean the steps were. They would have to be scrubbed regularly to keep the ash from staining them. Did the Ska who maintained the building know that their master was an imposter? How was Kelsier's benevolent plan to overthrow the final empire helping the common people who cleaned these steps? Thin and aging, Lord Renu wore a rich suit and a pair of aristocratic spectacles. A sparse gray mustache colored his lip, and despite his age, he didn't carry a cane for support. He nodded respectfully to Kelsier, but maintained a dignified air. Immediately, Vin was struck by one obvious fact. This man knows what he is doing. Cayman had been skilled at impersonating noblemen, but his self-importance had always struck Vin as a bit juvenile. While there were noblemen like Cayman, the more impressive ones were like this Lord Renu, calm and self-confident. Men whose ability was in their bearing, rather than their ability to speak scornfully to those around them. Vin had to resist cringing when the imposter's eyes fell on her. He seemed far too much a nobleman, and she had been trained to reflexively avoid their attention. The manor is looking much better, Kelsier said, shaking hands with Renew.
Yes, I'm impressed with its progress, Renew said. My cleaning crews are quite proficient. Give us a bit more time and the manor will be so grand that I wouldn't hesitate to host the Lord Ruler himself.
Kelsier chuckled. Wouldn't that be an odd dinner party? He stepped back, gesturing toward Vin. This is the young lady I spoke of. Renew studied her, and Vin glanced away. She didn't like it when people looked at her that way. It made her wonder how they were going to try and use her.
We will need to speak further of this, Kelsier, Renew said, nodding toward the mansion's entrance. The hour is late, but...
Kelsier stepped into the building. Late? Why, it's barely midnight. Have your people prepare some food. Lady Vin and I missed dinner. A missed meal was nothing new to Vin. However, Renew immediately waved to some servants, and they leapt into motion. Renew walked into the building, and Vin followed. She paused in the entryway, however, Sazed waiting patiently behind her. Kelsier paused, turning when he noticed that she wasn't following. Vin? It's so clean, Vin said, unable to think of any other description. On jobs, she'd occasionally seen the homes of noblemen. However, those times had happened at night in dark gloom. She was unprepared for the well-lit sight before her. The white marble floors of Manor Renew seemed to glow, reflecting the light of a dozen lanterns. Everything was pristine. The walls were white, except where they had been wash-painted with traditional animal murals. A brilliant chandelier sparkled above a double staircase, and the room's other decorations, crystal sculptures, vases set with bundles of aspen branches, glistened, unmarred by soot, smudge, or fingerprint. Kelsier chuckled. Well, her reaction speaks highly of your efforts, he said to Lord Renew. Vin allowed herself to be led into the building. The group turned right, entering a room whose whites were muted slightly by the addition of maroon furnishings and drapes. Renew paused.
Perhaps the lady could enjoy some refreshment here for a moment, he said to Kelsier. There are some matters of a delicate nature that I would discuss with you.
Kelsier shrugged. Fine with me, he said, following Renew toward another doorway. Says, why don't you keep Vin company while Lord Renew and I talk?
Of course, Master Kelsier.
Kelsier smiled, eyeing Vin, and somehow she knew that he was leaving Sazed behind to keep her from eavesdropping. She shot the departing men an annoyed look. What was it that you said about trust, Kelsier? However, she was even more annoyed at herself for getting unsettled. Why should she care if Kelsier excluded her? She had spent her entire life being ignored and dismissed. It had never bothered her before when other crew leaders left her out of their planning sessions. Vin took a seat in one of the stiffly upholstered maroon chairs, tucking her feet up beneath her. She knew what the problem was. Kelsier had been showing her too much respect, making her feel too important. She was beginning to think that she deserved to be part of his secret confidences. Reen's laughter in the back of her mind discredited those thoughts, and she sat, annoyed at both herself and Kelsier, feeling ashamed, but not exactly certain why. Renew's servants brought her a platter of fruits and breads. They set up a small stand beside her chair and even gave her a crystalline cup filled with a glistening red liquid. She couldn't tell if it was wine or juice, and she didn't intend to find out. She did, however, pick at the food. Her instincts wouldn't let her pass up a free meal, even if it was prepared by unfamiliar hands. Sazed walked over and took a position standing just behind her chair to the right. He waited with a stiff posture, hands clasped in front of him, eyes forward. The stance was obviously intended to be respectful, but his looming posture didn't help her mood any. Vin tried to focus on her surroundings, but this only reminded her of how rich the furnishings were. She was uncomfortable amid such finery. She felt as if she stood out like a black spot on a clean rug. She didn't eat the breads for fear that she would drop crumbs on the floor, and she worried at her feet and legs, which had been stained with ash while walking through the countryside, marring the furnishings. All of this cleanliness came at some Ska's expense, Vin thought. Why should I worry about disturbing it? However, she had trouble feeling outraged, for she knew this was only a front. Lord Renew had to maintain a certain level of finery. It would be suspicious to do otherwise. In addition, something else kept her from resenting the waste. The servants were happy. They went about their duties with a business-like professionalism, no sense of drudgery about their efforts. She heard laughter in the outer hallway. These were not mistreated Ska. Whether they had been included in Kelsier's plans or not was irrelevant. So, Vin sat and forced herself to eat fruit, yawning occasionally. It was turning out to be a long night indeed. The servants eventually left her alone, though Sazed continued to loom just behind her. I can't eat like this, she finally thought with frustration. Can you not stand over my shoulder like that? Sazed nodded. He took 2 steps forward so that he stood next to her chair rather than behind it. He adopted the same stiff posture, looming above her just as he had before. Vin froze in annoyance, then noticed the smile on Sazed's lips. He glanced down at her, eyes twinkling at his joke, and walked over and seated himself in the chair beside hers. I've never known a terraceman with a sense of humor before, Vin said dryly. Sazed raised an eyebrow. I was under the impression that you hadn't known any terracemen at all, Mistress Vin. Vin paused. Well, I've never heard of one with a sense of humor. You're supposed to be completely rigid and formal. We are just subtle, Mistress, Sazed said. Though he sat with a stiff posture, there was still something relaxed about him. It was as if he were as comfortable when sitting properly as other people were when lounging. That's how they're supposed to be. The perfect serving men, completely loyal to the final empire. Is something troubling you, Mistress Vin? Sazed asked as she studied him. How much does he know? Perhaps he doesn't even realize that Renew is an imposter. I was just wondering how you came here, she finally said. You mean, how did a terraceman steward end up as part of a rebellion intending to overthrow the final empire? Sazed asked in his soft voice. Vin flushed. Apparently he was well versed indeed. That is an intriguing question, Mistress, Sazed said. Certainly my situation is not common. I would say that I arrived at it because of belief. Belief? Yes, Sazed said. Tell me, Mistress, what is it that you believe? Vin frowned. What kind of a question is that? The most important kind, I think. Vin sat for a moment, but he obviously expected a reply, so she finally shrugged. I don't know. People often say that, Sazed said, but I find that it is rarely true. Do you believe in the final empire? I believe that it is strong, Vin said. Immortal? Vin shrugged. It has been so far. And the Lord Ruler, is he the ascended avatar of God? Do you believe that he, as the ministry teaches, is a sliver of infinity? I've never thought about it before. Perhaps you should, Sazed said. If, upon examination, you find that the ministry's teachings do not suit you, then I would be pleased to offer you an alternative. What alternative? Sazed smiled. That depends. The right belief is like a good cloak, I think. If it fits you well, it keeps you warm and safe. The wrong fit, however, can suffocate. Vin paused, frowning slightly, but Sazed just smiled. Eventually, she turned her attention back to her meal. After a short wait, the side door opened, and Kelsier and Renew returned. Now, Renew said as he and Kelsier seated themselves, a group of servants bringing another plate of food for Kelsier.
Let us discuss this child. The man you were going to have play my heir will not do, you say?
Unfortunately, Kelsier said, making quick work of his food.
That complicates things greatly,
Renew said. Kelsier shrugged. We'll just have Vin be your heir. Renew shook his head.
A girl her age could inherit, but it would be suspicious for me to pick her. There are any number of legitimate male cousins in the Renew line who would be far more suitable choices. It was going to be difficult enough to get a middle-aged man past courtly scrutiny. A young girl? No. Too many people would investigate her background. Our forged family lines will survive passing scrutiny. But if someone were to actually send messengers to search out her holdings...
Kelsier frowned.
Besides, Renew added, there is another issue. If I were to name a young unmarried girl as my heir, hers would instantly become one of the most sought-after hands in Luthadel. It would be very difficult for her to spy if she were to receive that much attention.
Vin flushed at the thought. Surprisingly, she found her heart sinking as the old impostor spoke. This was the only part Kelsier gave me in the plan. If I can't do it, what good am I to the crew? So, what do you suggest? Kelsier asked.
Well, she doesn't have to be my heir,
Renew said.
What if, instead, she were simply a young scion I brought with me to Luthadel? Perhaps I promised her parents, distant but favored cousins, that I would introduce their daughter to the court. Everyone would assume that my ulterior motive is to marry her off to a high noble family, thereby gaining myself another connection to those in power. However, she wouldn't draw much attention. She would be of low status, not to mention somewhat rural.
Which would explain why she's a bit less refined than other court members, Kelsier said. No offense, but... Vin looked up from hiding a piece of napkin-wrapped bread in her shirt pocket.
Why would I be offended?
Kelsier smiled. Never mind. Renew nodded to himself.
Yes, this will work much better. Everyone assumes that House Renew will eventually join the high nobility, so they'll accept Vin into their ranks out of courtesy. However, she herself will be unimportant enough that most people will ignore her. That is the ideal situation for what we will want her to do.
I like it, Kelsier said. Few people expect a man of your age in mercantile concerns to bother himself with balls and parties, but having a young socialite to send instead of a rejection note will serve as an advantage to your reputation.
Indeed,
Renew said.
She'll need some refinement, however, and not just in appearance.
Vin squirmed a bit beneath this scrutiny. It looked as if her part in the plan would go forward, and she suddenly realized what that meant. Being around Renew made her uncomfortable, and he was a fake nobleman. How would she react to an entire room full of real ones? I'm afraid I'll have to borrow Sazed from you for a while, Kelsier said.
Quite all right,
Renew said.
He's really not my steward, but yours.
Actually, Kelsier said, I don't think he's anybody's steward anymore, eh, Saz? Sazed cocked his head.
A terraceman without a master is like a soldier with no weapon, Master Kelsier. I have enjoyed my time attending to Lord Renew, as I am certain that I shall enjoy returning to your service.
Oh, you won't be returning to my service, Kelsier said. Sazed raised an eyebrow. Kelsier nodded to Vin. Renew is right, Saz. Vin needs some coaching, and I know plenty of high noblemen who are less refined than yourself. Do you think you could help the girl prepare?
I am certain that I could offer the young lady some aid,
Sazed said. Good, Kelsier said, popping one last cake in his mouth, then rising. I'm glad that's settled, because I'm starting to feel tired. And Poor Vin looks like she's about to nod off in the middle of her fruit plate.
I'm fine,
Vin said immediately, the assertion weakened slightly by a stifled yawn.
Sazed,
Renew said.
would you show them to the appropriate guest chambers? Of course, Master Renew,
Sazed said, rising from his seat in a smooth motion. Vin and Kelsier trailed the tall terraceman from the room as a group of servants took away the remnants of the meal.
I left food behind,
Vin noticed, feeling a bit drowsy. She wasn't certain what to think of the occurrence. As they crested the stairs and turned into a side hallway, Kelsier fell into place beside Vin. I'm sorry for excluding you back there, Vin. She shrugged.
There's no reason for me to know all of your plans.
Nonsense, Kelsier said. Your decision tonight makes you as much a part of this team as anyone else. Renew's words in private, however, were of a personal nature. He is a marvelous actor, but he feels very uncomfortable with people knowing the specifics of how he took Lord Renew's place. I promise you, nothing we discussed has any bearing on your part in the plan. Vin continued walking.
I believe you.
Good, Kelsier said with a smile, clapping her on the shoulder. Say as I know my way to the men's guest quarters. I was, after all, the one who bought this place. I can make my way from here.
Very well, Master Kelsier,
Sazed said with a respectful nod. Kelsier shot Vin a smile, then turned down a hallway, walking with his characteristically lively step. Vin watched him go, then followed Sazed down a different side passage, pondering the Allomancy training, her discussion with Kelsier in the carriage, and finally Kelsier's promise just a few moments before. The 3,000 boxings, a fortune in coins, was a strange weight tied to her belt. Eventually, Sazed opened a particular door for her, walking in to light the lanterns.
The linens are fresh, and I will send maids to prepare you a bath in the morning.
He turned, handing her his candle.
Would you require anything else?
Vin shook her head. Sazed smiled, bid her good evening, then walked back out in the hallway. Vin stood silently for a short moment, studying the room. Then she turned, glancing once again in the direction Kelsier had gone.
Sazed?
She said, peeking back out into the hallway. The steward paused, turning back.
Yes, Mistress Vin? Kelsier,
Vin said quietly.
He's a good man, isn't he?
Sazed smiled.
A very good man, Mistress. One of the best I've known.
Vin nodded slightly.
A good man, she said softly. I don't think I've ever known one of those before.
Sazed smiled, then bowed his head respectfully and turned to leave. Vin let the door swing shut. The end of Part 1. Part 2. Rebels beneath a sky of ash. In the end, I worry that my arrogance shall destroy us all. 9. Vin pushed against the coin and threw herself up into the mist. She flew away from earth and stone, soaring through the dark currents of the sky, wind fluttering her cloak. This is freedom, she thought, breathing deeply of the cool, damp air. She closed her eyes, feeling the passing wind. This was what I was always missing, yet never knew it. She opened her eyes as she began to descend. She waited until the last moment, then flicked a coin. It hit the cobblestones, and she pushed against it lightly, slowing her descent. She burned pewter with a flash and hit the ground running, dashing along Feliza's quiet streets. The late autumn air was cool, but winters were generally mild in the central dominance. Some years passed without even a flake of snow. She tossed a coin backward, then used it to push herself slightly up and to the right. She landed on a low stone wall, barely breaking stride as she ran spryly along the wall's top. Burning pewter enhanced more than muscles. It increased all the body's physical abilities. Keeping pewter at a low burn gave her a sense of balance that any night burglar would have envied. The wall turned north, and Vin paused at the corner. She fell into a crouch, bare feet and sensitive fingers gripping the chill stone. Her copper on to hide her allomancy, she flared tin to strain her senses. Stillness. Aspens made insubstantial ranks in the mist, like emaciated ska standing in their work lines. Estates rolled in the distance, each one walled, manicured, and well guarded. There were far fewer dots of light in the city than there were in Luthadel. Many of the homes were only part-time residences, their masters away visiting some other sliver of the final empire. Blue lines suddenly appeared before her, one end of each pointing at her chest, the other disappearing into the mists. Vin immediately jumped to the side, dodging as a pair of coins shot past in the night air, leaving trails in the mist. She flared pewter, landing on the cobbled street beside the wall. Her tin-enhanced ears picked out a scraping sound. Then a dark form shot into the sky, a few blue lines pointing to his coin pouch. Vin dropped a coin and threw herself into the air after her opponent. They soared for a moment, flying up the grounds of some unsuspecting nobleman. Vin's opponent suddenly changed course in the air, jerking toward the mansion itself. Vin followed, letting go of the coin below her, instead burning iron and pulling on one of the mansion's window latches. Her opponent hit first, and she heard a thud as he ran into the side of the building. He was off a second later. A light brightened, and a confused head poked out of a window as Vin spun in the air, landing feet first against the mansion. She immediately kicked off of the vertical surface, angling herself slightly and pushing against the same window latch. Glass cracked, and she shot away into the night before gravity could reclaim her. Vin flew through the mists, eyes straining to keep track of her quarry. He shot a couple of coins back at her, but she pushed them away with a dismissive thought. A hazy blue line fell downward, a dropped coin, and her opponent moved to the side again. Vin dropped her own coin and pushed. However, her coin suddenly jerked backward along the ground, the result of a push from her opponent. The sudden move changed the trajectory of Vin's jump, throwing her sideways. She cursed, flicking another coin to the side, using it to push herself back on track. By then, she'd lost her quarry. All right, she thought, hitting the soft ground just inside the wall. She emptied a few coins into her hand, then tossed the mostly full pouch into the air, giving it a strong push in the direction she had seen her quarry disappear. The pouch disappeared into the mists, trailing a faint blue allomantic line. A scattering of coins suddenly shot from the bushes ahead, streaking toward her bag. Vin smiled. Her opponent had assumed that the flying pouch was Vin herself. He was too far away to see the coins in her hand, just as he had been too far away for her to see the coins he carried. A dark figure jumped out of the bushes, hopping up onto the stone wall. Vin waited quietly as the figure ran along the wall and slipped down onto the other side. Vin launched herself straight up into the air, then threw her handful of coins at the figure passing below. He immediately pushed, sending the coins streaking away, but they were only a distraction. Vin landed on the ground before him, twin glass knives whipping from her sheaths. She lunged, slashing, but her opponent jumped backward. Something's wrong. Vin ducked and threw herself to the side as a handful of glittering coins, her coins, the ones her opponent had pushed away, shot back down from the sky into her opponent's hand. He turned and sprayed them in her direction. She dropped her daggers with a quiet yelp, thrusting her hands forward and pushing on the coins. Immediately she was thrown backward, as her push was matched by her opponent. One of the coins lurched in the air, hanging directly between the two of them. The rest of the coins disappeared into the mists, pushed sideways by conflicting forces. Vin flared her steel as she flew, and heard her opponent grunt as he was pushed backward as well. Her opponent hit the wall. Vin slammed into a tree, but she flared pewter and ignored the pain. She used the wood to brace herself, continuing to push. The coin quivered in the air, trapped between the amplified strength of two allomancers. The pressure increased. Vin gritted her teeth, feeling the small aspen bend behind her. Her opponent's pushing was relentless.
Will not be beaten.
Vin thought, flaring both steel and pewter, grunting slightly as she threw the entire force of her strength at the coin. There was a moment of silence. Then Vin lurched backward, the tree cracking with a loud snap in the night air. Vin hit the ground in a tumble, splinters of wood scattered around. Even tin and pewter weren't enough to keep her mind clear as she rolled across the cobblestones, eventually coming to a dizzy rest. A dark figure approached, mist cloak ribbons billowing around him. Vin lurched to her feet, grasping for knives she'd forgotten that she'd dropped. Kelsier put down his hood and held her knives toward her. One was broken. I know it's instinctual, Vin, but you don't have to put your hands forward when you push. Nor do you have to drop what you're holding. Vin grimaced in the darkness, rubbing her shoulder and nodding as she accepted the daggers. Nice job with the pouch, Kelsier said. You had me for a moment. For all the good it did, Vin grumbled. You've only been doing this for a few months, Vin, he said lightly. All things considered, your progress is fantastic. I would, however, recommend that you avoid push matches with people who weigh more than you. He paused, eyeing Vin's short figure and thin frame. Which probably means avoiding them with pretty much everybody. Vin sighed, stretching slightly. She'd have more bruises. At least they won't be visible. Now that the bruises Cayman had given her face were finally gone, Sazed had warned her to be careful. Makeup could only cover so much, and she would have to look like a proper young noblewoman if she were going to infiltrate the court. Here, Kelsier said, handing her something. A souvenir. Vin held up the object, the coin they had pushed between them. It was bent and flattened from the pressure. I'll see you back at the mansion, Kelsier said. Vin nodded, and Kelsier disappeared into the night. He's right, she thought. I'm smaller, I weigh less, and I have a shorter reach than anyone I'm likely to fight. If I attack someone head-on, I'll lose. The alternative had always been her method anyway, to struggle quietly, to stay unseen. She had to learn to use allomancy the same way. Kelsier kept saying she was developing amazingly fast as an allomancer. He seemed to think it was his teaching, but Vin felt it was something else. The mists, the night prowling, it all felt right to her. She was not worried about mastering allomancy in time to help Kelsier against other Mistborn. It was her other part in the plan that worried her. Sighing, Vin hopped over the wall to search for her coin pouch. Up at the mansion, not Renou's home, but one owned by some other nobleman, lights were on and people milled about. None of them ventured deeply into the night. The sky would fear mist wraiths. The nobility would have guessed that Mistborn had caused the disturbance. Neither one was something a sane person would want to confront. Vin eventually traced her pouch by steel line to the upper branches of a tree. She pulled it slightly, tugging it down into her hand, then made her way back out to the street. Kelsier would probably have left the pouch behind. The 24 or so clips it contained wouldn't have been worth his time. However, for most of her life, Vin had scrounged and starved. She just couldn't force herself to be wasteful. Even tossing coins to jump with made her uncomfortable. So, she used her coins sparingly as she traveled back toward Renou's mansion, instead pushing and pulling off of buildings and discarded bits of metal. The half-jumping, half-running gait of a Mistborn came naturally to her now, and she didn't have to think much about her movements. How would she fare trying to pretend to be a noblewoman? She couldn't hide her apprehensions, not from herself. Cayman had been good at imitating noblemen because of his self-confidence, and that was one attribute Vin knew she didn't have. Her success with allomancy only proved that her place was in corners and shadows, not striding around in pretty dresses at courtly balls. Kelsier, however, refused to let her back out. Vin landed in a crouch just outside Mansion Renew, puffing slightly from exertion. She regarded the lights with a slight feeling of apprehension. You've got to learn to do this, Vin, Kelsier kept telling her. You're a talented allomancer, but you'll need more than steel pushes to succeed against the nobility. Until you can move in their society as easily as you do in the mists, you'll be at a disadvantage. Letting out a quiet sigh, Vin rose from her crouch, then took off her mist cloak and stuffed it away for later retrieval. Then she walked up the steps and into the building. When she asked after Sazed, the mansion servants directed her to the kitchens, so she made her way into the closed-off hidden section of the mansion that was the servants' quarters. Even these parts of the building were kept immaculately clean. Vin was beginning to understand why Renew made such a convincing imposter. He didn't allow for imperfection. If he maintained his impersonation half as well as he maintained order in his mansion, then Vin doubted anyone would ever discover the ruse. But, she thought, he must have some flaw. Back in the meeting 2 months ago, Kelsier said that Renew wouldn't be able to withstand scrutiny by an Inquisitor. Perhaps they'd be able to sense something about his emotions, something that gives him away. It was a small item, but Vin had not forgotten it. Despite Kelsier's words about honesty and trust, he still had his secrets. Everyone did. Sazed was indeed to be found in the kitchens. He stood with a middle-aged servant. She was tall for a Ska woman, though standing next to Sazed made her look diminutive. Vin recognized her as a member of the mansion staff. Kosan was her name. Vin had made an effort to memorize all of the names of the local staff, if only to keep tabs on them. Sazed looked over as Vin entered.
Ah, Mistress Vin. Your return is quite timely.
He gestured to his companion.
This is Kosan.
Kosan studied Vin with a businesslike air. Vin longed to return to the mists where people couldn't look at her like that.
It is long enough now, I think,
Sazed said.
Probably, Kosan said. But I cannot perform miracles, Master Vought.
Sazed nodded. Vought was apparently the proper title for a Terraceman steward. Not quite Ska, but definitely not nobleman, the Terraceman held a very strange place in Imperial society. Vin studied the two of them suspiciously.
Your hair, Mistress,
Sazed said with a calm tone.
Kosan is going to cut it for you.
Oh, Vin said, reaching up. Her hair was getting a bit long for her taste, though somehow she doubted that Sazed was going to let her have it cropped boyishly short. Kosan waved to a chair, and Vin reluctantly seated herself. She found it unnerving to sit docilely while someone worked with shears so close to her head, but there was no getting around it. After a few moments of running her hands through Vin's hair, tisking quietly, Kosan began to snip.
Such beautiful hair,
she said, almost as if to herself.
Thick, with a nice deep black color. It's a shame to see it cared for so poorly, Master Vought. Many courtly women would die for hair like this. It has just enough body to lie full, but is straight enough to work with easily.
Sazed smiled.
We'll have to see that it receives better care in the future, he said.
Kosan continued her work, nodding to herself. Eventually, Sazed walked over and took a seat just a few feet in front of Vin.
Kelsier hasn't returned yet, I assume?
Vin asked. Sazed shook his head and Vin sighed. Kelsier didn't think she was practiced enough to go with him on his nightly raids, many of which he went on directly following his training sessions with Vin. During the last 2 months, Kelsier had put in appearances on the properties of a dozen different noble houses, both in Luthadel and in Feliz. He varied his disguises and apparent motives, trying to create an air of confusion among the great houses.
What?
Vin asked, eyeing Sazed, who was regarding her with a curious look. The Terraceman nodded his head slightly with respect.
I was wondering if you might be willing to listen to another proposal.
Vin sighed, rolling her eyes.
Fine.
It isn't like I can do anything else but sit here.
I think I have the perfect religion for you,
Sazed said, his normally stoic face revealing a glimmer of eagerness.
It is called Trelegism, after the god Trell. Trell was worshipped by a group called the Nilazan, a people who lived far to the north. In their land, the day and night cycle was very odd. During some months of the year, it was dark for most of the day. During the summer, however, it grew dark for only a few hours at a time. The Nilazon believed that there was beauty in darkness, and that the daylight was more profane. They saw the stars as the thousand eyes of Trell watching them. The sun was the single jealous eye of Trell's brother Nolt. Since Nolt only had one eye, he made it blaze brightly to outshine his brother. The Nilazon, however, were not impressed, and preferred to worship the quiet Trell, who watched over them even when Nolt obscured the sky.
Sazed fell silent. Vin wasn't sure how to respond, so she didn't say anything.
"It really is a good religion, Mistress Vin," Sazed said. "Very gentle, yet very powerful. The Nilazon were not an advanced people, but they were quite determined. They mapped the entire night sky, counting and placing every major star. Their ways suit you, especially their preference of the night. I can tell you more if you wish."
Vin shook her head.
"That's all right, Sazed." "Not a good fit, then?" Sazed said, frowning slightly. "Ah, well. I shall have to consider it some more. Thank you, mistress. You are very patient with me, I think."
"Consider it some more?" Vin asked. "That's the